Before we begin, if you enjoy story narrations like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss future ones.
The first time Mara Linton saw the woman in the photograph, she thought it was a model. The face was lit from the side, the cheekbones sharp as if carved. The hair fell in a deliberate, effortless wave. The eyes, dark, steady, looked straight at the camera as if they were measuring the viewer for worth. The caption read, "New City, New Light." #Bloom. Mara had been scrolling at 2 in the morning, the kind of late hour when the world feels like a private room and other people's lives are a kind of voyeuristic comfort. She had followed the account for months, Anna Vera official, because the images were clean and the captions were small. Precise confessions about coffee, trains, and the way light hit a certain corner of a cafe. The account had a rhythm, a photograph, a line of text, a string of comments that praised and curated. It was the kind of life that looked like a promise. 2 days later, the account posted nothing. Then a week later, a friend of the woman, someone who used the handle Quietly Kate, left a comment. "Where are you, Anna?" The comment sat like a pebble in a pond. No reply, no likes. The account remained still. Mara worked at the City Archive, a job that required patience and a taste for other people's histories. She had a habit of noticing small things, the way a ledger's ink bled, the way a photograph's edges curled. When she saw the comment, she clicked through the account and found a pattern that made her stomach tighten. There were gaps, weeks of silence, then a flurry of posts at odd hours. There were photos taken in places that did not match the captions. There were messages in the account's direct inbox that had been left unread. Mara did what she always did when something lodged in her mind. She made a file. She downloaded the posts, saved the comments, and printed a photograph of the woman, Anna Vera, if the account was to be believed, on glossy paper. She wrote the date at the top in small, neat letters, June 3rd, the last seen online. Then she went to bed and dreamed of glass houses. Detective Jonah Hale got the call at 6:07 a.m. The voice on the line was a woman's, thin with sleep and something else, an edge that made Jonah sit up. "My sister's gone," she said. "She didn't come home last night." The caller was Lila Moreno, 29, who ran a small floral shop on the east side and who had the kind of hands that smelled of soil and citrus. Lila's voice was steady in the way people are steady when they have rehearsed grief. She told Jonah that her sister, who used the name Anna Vera online, had not been seen in 2 days. She said Anna had left a note on the kitchen table, "I'll be back," and that the apartment door had been locked from the inside. Jonah had been a detective for 7 years. He had learned to treat every missing person call as a knot to be untied. Start with the obvious, then follow the thread. He drove to the apartment building, a narrow brick block that leaned into the street like a secret. The building smelled of coffee and laundry detergent. Anna's apartment was on the 3rd floor, a small place with a balcony that looked over a courtyard where a single lemon tree grew in a cracked pot. Inside, the apartment was tidy in a way that suggested someone who curated their life for the camera. Books were stacked by color. A record player sat on a mid-century table. A laptop lay open on the couch, its screen dark. On the kitchen table, a small square of paper had been left face down. Jonah turned it over. The note read in a hurried hand, "Back soon." Don't worry, there were no signs of forced entry. The windows were latched. The balcony door was locked. Jonah walked the apartment with a practiced eye. A hair on the sink, a smudge on the mirror, a coffee cup with lipstick at the rim. He found a small notebook under a stack of magazines. Inside were lists, places to visit, names to call, a string of phone numbers. One entry was circled, M at 9 p.m. Jonah made a note. Lila sat on the couch and folded her hands in her lap. She told Jonah about Anna's life, the online persona, the freelance photography, the part-time job at a gallery. She said Anna had been restless lately. that she had been talking about leaving the city, about finding a place that felt like a secret. Lila's voice broke when she said the word secret. Jonah left the apartment with a list of leads and a photograph of Anna. He drove to the gallery where Anna had worked and found a manager who described her as quiet and precise, someone who arrived early and left late. The manager mentioned a client, an older man who had commissioned a series of portraits and who had been particularly insistent about privacy. The manager could not remember the man's name but described him as polite and a little intense. The first week of the investigation was a slow, patient thing. Jonah and his partner, Mara, not the same Mara who had first noticed the account, knocked on doors, checked surveillance footage, and called friends. They found Anna's phone turned off. They found a taxi receipt for a ride taken 2 nights earlier to a neighborhood on the city's edge. They found a message thread in Anna's phone, drafts of replies never sent, a string of ellipses, a single line, "I can't do this tonight." The online account remained still. The comments grew anxious. Someone started a hashtag, #FindAnnaVera. The hashtag gathered momentum like a small storm. People posted screenshots, theories, and prayers. The internet is a place that amplifies absence into noise. Then Jonah found something that made the case tilt. He was reviewing Anna's bank records when he noticed a series of small withdrawals, cash taken out at odd hours, amounts that suggested someone was paying for things in cash to avoid a trace. The withdrawals were followed by deposits from an account Jonah did not recognize. He traced the deposits to a shell company registered under a name that meant nothing to him. The money trail was a faint, deliberate thing. At the same time, Mara, the archive worker, kept digging. She found that Anna's online persona had layers. The Anna Vera official account was public and polished, but there were other accounts, private handles with fewer followers, images that were darker, captions that read like confessions. In one private account, Anna posted a photograph of a small, overgrown garden with a caption, "This is where I go when I need to remember who I am." The photograph was geotagged to a place Jonah's team had not yet visited, a community garden on the city's outskirts called the Glass Garden. The Glass Garden was a place of reclaimed plots and makeshift trellises, a patchwork of people who grew food and secrets. Jonah and Mara drove there and found a community of gardeners who knew Anna by sight, but not by name. She had volunteered, they said, helping to tend a plot that belonged to an elderly woman named Rosa. Rosa remembered Anna's hands, quick, careful, and the way she would sit on the garden bench and write in a small notebook. Rosa's eyes clouded when Jonah asked about Anna. "She was a good girl," Rosa said. "She had a way of making the garden look like a photograph." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "She had a man who came sometimes. He would sit at the edge of the garden and watch. He never touched the plants. He just watched." The description fit the manager's memory of the client. Jonah felt the case narrow into a shape. He asked Rosa if she could describe the man. Rosa hesitated, then said, "He wore a hat. He smelled like cedar. He had a way of looking at people like he was measuring them." Back at the station, Jonah pulled the surveillance footage from the taxi company and found a clip of Anna stepping out of a cab near a row of warehouses. The footage showed a man waiting in the shadows, his hat low. He spoke to Anna for a moment, then they walked together toward the warehouses. The footage cut off as they entered a side door. Jonah's chest tightened. He had seen this pattern before, a woman who curated her life for the camera, a private account that hinted at a refuge, a man who watched from the edges. The question was not only where Anna had gone, but what she had been trying to hide. Mara's archive work turned up another thread. She found a comment on an old post years before where Anna had replied to someone who asked about her name. Anna had written, "Names are like windows. Some people look out, some people look in." The line read like a clue and like a dare. As the days stretched, the public's appetite for answers grew. The hashtag became a chorus. The gallery held a vigil. People left candles and Polaroids at the base of the lemon tree outside Anna's building. The city's news picked up the story and turned it into a narrative about the dangers of curated lives. Opinion pieces argued that the internet had made people into objects to be consumed. Others said the internet had made people visible in ways that could save them. Jonah felt the pressure of the public and the private at once. He had to keep the investigation tight, to follow the money in the footage, but he also had to listen to the small human things, the way Lila folded her hands, the way Rosa's voice trembled when she said "good girl." He kept thinking about the photograph Mara had printed, the woman with the model's cheekbones, and about the private accounts that showed a different face. A woman who sometimes looked tired, sometimes fierce, sometimes afraid. On the 10th day, Jonah's team found a lead that changed everything. A maintenance worker at the warehouses remembered a delivery truck that had come and gone the night Anna disappeared. The truck had been registered to a catering company that served private events. Jonah called the company and learned they had been hired for a closed-door dinner at a private estate on the night in question. The estate belonged to a man named Victor Hale, no relation to Jonah, who was known in certain circles for hosting exclusive gatherings where privacy was part of the price. Victor Hale's name was a key that fit into the lock Jonah had been turning. He was a man who cultivated discretion, wealthy, private, and with a taste for the curated. Jonah requested a warrant to search the estate. The legal wheels turned slowly, but when they did, they revealed a room in the basement that had been converted into a studio. Soft lights, a backdrop, a set of chairs arranged like an audience. On a shelf, Jonah found a stack of Polaroids, portraits of women, each with a small note on the back. For the collection. One photograph was Anna's. The discovery was a blow. The Polaroids were not explicit, but they were intimate in a way that made Jonah's skin crawl. He felt the case shift from missing person to something that smelled of ownership. He thought of the jars in the Marlowe's barn from another case, of ledgers and promises. He thought of the way people make private economies out of other people's bodies. Victor Hale's lawyer called Jonah's supervisor and demanded a halt. The lawyer's voice was smooth and practiced. He argued that the photographs were art, that the estate was private property, and that the search had been intrusive. The DA's office pushed back. The law is a slow machine, and privacy is a complicated thing. Meanwhile, Mara, the archive worker, kept digging into Anna's private accounts. She found a message thread between Anna and a user named Cedar Watcher, a handle that matched the scent Rosa had described. The messages were careful at first, questions about light, about composition, but they grew more intimate. In one exchange, Cedar Watcher wrote, "You don't have to perform for me. I want to see the parts you hide." Anna replied, "I don't know if I can stop performing." The line read like a confession. Jonah felt the case tighten into a moral knot. A woman who curated her life for the camera, a man who wanted what she hid, a private economy that traded intimacy for money and secrecy. The question was whether Anna had gone willingly into that economy or whether she had been taken. On the 15th day, Jonah received a call from the lab. They had processed a hair found on Anna's balcony railing. The hair matched a DNA profile in the national database, one that belonged to a man with a history of coercive behavior. The man's name was not Victor Hale, but he had been seen at several of Victor's gatherings. The network was wider than Jonah had imagined. That night, Jonah sat at his kitchen table and looked at the photograph Mara had printed. The woman in the image looked back at him with a face that was both ordinary and unknowable. Jonah thought about the private accounts, the Polaroids, the messages, and the way the city had become a place where people could be both visible and invisible. He thought about the thin line between consent and coercion, between performance and captivity. He also thought about Mara, the archive worker, who had started this by noticing a comment. He thought about how small acts of attention can become the hinge on which a case turns. He picked up his phone and typed a message to her. "Keep looking. Don't stop." Then he put the phone down and waited for the next piece of the story to fall into place. At 2 in the morning, Jonah woke to a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. Some things are meant to be beautiful and left alone." The message had no signature. Jonah felt the air in the room go thin. He looked at the photograph again and realized that the woman's eyes seemed to be asking him a question he could not yet answer. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, the apartment was quiet. The case had become a mirror. The more Jonah looked, the more he saw himself reflected in the questions he asked. He wondered which reflection would be truer, the one that found Anna alive or the one that found the truth buried under layers of curated light. The glass garden waited at the city's edge, a place where people planted things and secrets took root. Jonah knew that to find Anna, he would have to walk into that garden and pull at the roots until something gave. He also knew that pulling at roots can uproot more than you expect. The story was only beginning. Mara Linton worked with other people's pasts for a living. The city archives smelled of paper and lemon oil. It smelled of time kept tidy. She liked the way a ledger's margins could tell you more than its columns, the way a photograph's edges curled like a secret. When she first pulled up Anna Vera Official on her lunch break, she thought she was looking at a carefully composed life. Light, coffee, trains, a face that knew how to hold itself for the camera. When she clicked through the private handles, she felt the air change. The private accounts were not hidden in any sophisticated way. Anna had used different emails and phone numbers for different circles, the kind of compartmentalization that felt like a practical habit rather than a conspiracy. One account was a public portfolio, clean images, gallery tags, polite comments. Another was a private feed with fewer followers, images taken at odd hours, a hand on a fence, a pair of shoes abandoned on a stair, a close crop of a wrist with a faint bruise. The captions were shorter, more urgent. "I can't sleep. Do you ever feel like you're two people?" "This place smells like cedar and old books." Mara printed the private posts and taped them to a sheet of paper. She circled phrases with a red pen the way she used to circle lines in old diaries at the archive. The geotags were the most useful. A cluster of posts from the glass garden, a few from a neighborhood near the warehouses, and one from a private estate that matched the address Jonah had pulled for Victor Hale. The private posts read like a map of refuge and unease. She sent Jonah a short email with the attachments and a single line. "Private accounts show glass garden geotags. Might be refuge." He replied within the hour. On it. "Meet me at the garden at 3. Jonah's messages were efficient. They left space for the work to fill. The glass garden was a patchwork of reclaimed plots behind a row of low brick buildings. It smelled of compost and lemon rind, of wet earth and the faint metallic tang of city air. People had built trellises from old ladders and strung lights between the plots. There were benches made from pallets and a small shed painted a cheerful blue. It was the kind of place that looked like a photograph, even when it was not being photographed. Rosa tended the plot that Anna had favored. She was small and quick, with hands that had the calluses of a lifetime of pruning. Her hair was the color of iron filings, and she wore a cardigan with elbow patches. When Jonah and Mara found her, she was kneeling by a row of basil, humming under her breath. "You're Jonah, aren't you?" she asked before they introduced themselves. The gardeners knew the police in the way people know the weather, as a presence that could change the day. Jonah nodded. Mara introduced herself and showed Rosa the printed posts. Rosa's face softened when she saw Anna's handwriting in the captions. "She was here," Rosa said. She liked the corner by the lemon tree, sat on the bench and wrote. She had a way of making the garden look like a photograph, even when she wasn't taking one. Her voice had the slow cadence of someone who had watched seasons pass. Rosa hesitated, then added, "There was a man who came sometimes. He would sit at the edge and watch. He smelled like cedar. He never touched the plants. He just watched. She tapped the side of her nose as if to indicate the way the man watched, measured, precise. Jonah asked for a description. Rosa's memory was a sketch, a hat, a coat, a posture that kept its distance. She could not give a name. She could only give the impression of a presence that belonged to the margins. Jonah made notes. He felt the case tighten around a shape he could almost see. Mara walked the garden and noticed small things. A scrap of fabric caught on a trellis, a footprint in the soft soil, a tin box tucked under a bench. The box was rusted at the edges and had been pushed into the earth as if someone had wanted it to be found later. Mara pried it open with a fingernail. Inside was a Polaroid and a folded scrap of paper. The photograph showed Anna sitting on a bench, her head tilted, a lemon tree behind her. On the back, in a hurried hand, were the words, "For when I forget who I am." Mara felt the photograph like a small, private thing that had been left in public. She slid it into an evidence bag and called Jonah. He arrived within 20 minutes, his coat still damp from the city drizzle. He looked at the Polaroid and then at the garden as if the place had shifted under his feet. "We'll log this," he said, "but keep it quiet. We don't want to spook anyone." His voice was careful. Mara had seen him in the field before. He had a way of moving that suggested he wanted to be useful without being intrusive. They left the garden with the tin box and the Polaroid, and a list of names Rosa had given them. People who had seen Anna, people who had offered her a cup of tea, people who had noticed the watcher. The list was small and human. It was the kind of map that could be followed. Back at the station, Jonah handed the financial trail to Priya, the department's financial investigator. Priya had a reputation for patience and an eye for the faintest irregularity. She worked in a cubicle that smelled of coffee and printer toner, and she liked to say that money left fingerprints if you knew where to look. The withdrawals were small at first, $50, $70, $100 taken from different ATMs at odd hours. The pattern suggested someone paying in cash to avoid a trace. The deposits that followed were the more interesting part. Small sums funneled into an account that belonged to a shell. Company registered under a name that meant nothing to Jonah. Priya traced the shell company to a trust with multiple donors and a corporate address. That was a mailbox in a business park. "It's a network," Priya said, tapping at her keyboard. "Not just one patron." Multiple accounts, small transfers, a trust that funnels money to private events. It's designed to keep things off the books. She pulled up a ledger on her screen. Names, dates, amounts. Some entries were annotated with shorthand: event, studio, collection. The ledger had the cadence of a bookkeeping system that had been repurposed for discretion. Jonah felt the case widen. The Polaroid in the tin box had been a small, human artifact. The ledger was a machine. He thought of the private studio in Victor Hale's basement and the stack of Polaroids with notes on the back. The pieces were beginning to fit into a pattern that suggested a private economy built on curated intimacy. Priya's next find was a receipt from a catering company. The company had been hired for a closed-door dinner at Victor Hale's estate on the night Anna disappeared. The receipt matched the maintenance worker's memory of a delivery truck. The catering company's records showed a series of similar events: private dinners, studio nights, gatherings billed as artistic salons. The invoices were legitimate. The descriptions were vague. "It's plausible deniability," Priya said. "You call it a salon, you bill it as catering, and you keep the guest list private. The money moves through a trust, and the trust pays vendors in cash. It's a closed loop." She looked at Jonah. If Anna was there, she might have been paid in cash, or she might have been there by choice, or she might have been coerced. The ledger won't tell us which. Mara kept working the archive side of the case. She had a knack for pattern recognition that came from years of cataloguing other people's lives. She found a message thread on one of Anna's private accounts between Anna and a user named Cedar Watcher. The messages were careful at first. questions about light, about composition, but they grew more intimate. In one exchange, Cedar Watcher wrote, "You don't have to perform for me. I want to see the parts you hide." Anna replied, "I don't know if I can stop performing." Mara printed the thread and circled the line. She felt the sentence like a hinge. It suggested a dynamic that was not purely transactional. It suggested a man who wanted to possess the unperformed parts of a person, who wanted authenticity but only on his terms. The line read like a confession and like a threat. Jonah took the message thread to Victor's lawyer and to the DA. Victor's lawyer argued that private correspondence did not prove coercion. The DA, Eleanor Park, listened and then said what Jonah had been thinking. The law required evidence of force, threat, or deception. Messages could suggest a pattern, but they could not convict on their own. The legal threshold was a narrow bridge to cross. The public, however, did not wait for legal thresholds. The hashtag #DashaFindAnavera had become a small movement. People posted screenshots, theories, and prayers. Some commenters argued that Anna had chosen to disappear. Others insisted she had been taken. The internet is a place that amplifies absence into certainty, and certainty is often wrong. Then Jonah found the taxi footage that showed Anna stepping out near the warehouses and meeting a man in a hat. The footage cut off as they entered a side door. He had the maintenance worker's testimony about the catering truck. He had the Polaroid from the glass garden. He had the ledger and the shell company. The case had a shape that suggested a private network of events where discretion was the product. He also had a hair from Anna's balcony railing that the lab had matched to a DNA profile in the national database. The profile belonged to a man with a history of coercive behavior who had been seen at several of Victor's gatherings. Jonah felt the room tilt. The man's name was not Victor's, but the man had been part of the same orbit. The network was wider than a single patron. Jonah and Mara met late that evening in a small coffee shop near the station. The place was quiet, the kind of shop that kept its lights low and its music softer than the city's noise. They spread photographs and printouts across the table like a map. Mara pushed the Polaroid from the glass garden toward Jonah. "She left this in the garden," she said. "It feels like a message to herself." Jonah looked at the photograph and then at Mara. "She was leaving breadcrumbs," he said. Or she was leaving a trail for someone she trusted. Either way, it's deliberate. Mara tapped a line on her printout. "Look at the timestamps on the private posts. There are gaps, weeks of silence, then a flurry of activity. She would post at odd hours, like she was awake when the rest of the world slept. And the private posts are different in tone." "They're not curated. They're raw," Jonah nodded. People curate their public lives and keep private accounts for the things they can't say out loud. But private accounts can also be a place where someone rehearses a different life. We need to know which one Anna wanted. They left the coffee shop with a plan. Jonah would pursue the financial trail and the maintenance workers' leads. Mara would keep digging through Anna's private accounts in the archive for anything that suggested a pattern of movement, addresses, names, photographs. Priya would follow the money and try to trace the trust's donors. Rosa and the gardeners would be asked to keep an eye out for the watcher. The next morning, Jonah obtained a warrant to search Victor Hale's estate more thoroughly. The legal process moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a machine that had been designed to protect rights and to prevent abuse. Victor's lawyer objected, citing privacy and artistic freedom. The DA pushed back, citing the Polaroids and the ledger. The judge signed the warrant. The search turned up more Polaroids, more notes on the backs of photographs, and a ledger that listed names and dates. Some names were crossed out, others were circled. The ledger had the cadence of a record keeper who wanted to remember and to control. On a shelf in the studio, Jonah found a stack of envelopes, some empty, some with cash. One envelope had Anna's name on it in a handwriting that matched the note on the Polaroid from the glass garden. Victor's lawyer called the discovery a misunderstanding. "These are artistic materials," he said. "People consent to be photographed. They sign releases. This is not a crime. The DA, however, had seen enough to ask for subpoenas and to widen the investigation. The ledger suggested a pattern of private events and payments that required explanation. That evening, Jonah received an anonymous text. "Stop digging. Some things are meant to be beautiful and left alone." The message had no signature. Jonah felt the air in his apartment go thin. He thought of the Polaroid in the tin box, of Anna's private posts, of the man who smelled like cedar. He thought of the ledger and the trust and the way money could make silence a commodity. He called Mara and left a message. "Be careful. Don't go alone to the garden tonight." She replied with a single line, "I won't, but I'm not stopping." Mara did not stop. She went back to the archive and found a small encrypted file on Anna's laptop, an old habit of Anna's, a way to keep certain things private even from herself. Mara worked through the encryption with the patience of someone who had spent years coaxing secrets from brittle paper. The file opened to a short video clip, Anna in a studio, speaking to someone off camera. Her voice was low and steady. She said, "I don't want to be a thing. I want to be a person." The clip ended with a shot of a hand reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. Mara watched the clip 3 times. Each time she felt the same small, sharp ache. The clip suggested a woman who had tried to speak and had been interrupted. It suggested a dynamic that was not purely transactional. It suggested a man who wanted to possess the unperformed parts of a person. She printed a still from the clip and circled the hand. The hand was gloved. It was not Victor's hand, not from what she could tell. It was a hand that belonged to someone who preferred to remain in the shadows. When Jonah saw the still, he felt the case narrow and widen at once. The studio footage suggested a private session that had gone wrong. The ledger suggested a network that had normalized secrecy. The Polaroid suggested a woman who had left herself a message. The anonymous text suggested someone who wanted the investigation to stop. They were no longer simply looking for a missing person. They were tracing a system that had turned discretion into a commodity and people into objects of curation. The work required patience and care. It required the kind of attention Mara had given to other people's histories and the kind of stubbornness Jonah had learned in the field. That night, Jonah drove past the glass garden and slowed. The place was dark, the trellises like black skeletons against the sky. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing. I want to be a person." He thought of the private accounts and the ledger, and the way the city could make a person both visible and invisible. He parked and sat for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. He felt the case like a weight in his hands. He thought of the Polaroid in the tin box and the photograph of Anna on the bench. He thought of the man who smelled like cedar and the hand that had reached for the camera. Somewhere in the city, someone was watching. Some ledger was being updated. Some person was deciding whether to speak. Jonah turned the key and drove home, the night pressing close. The investigation had moved from the edges into the center of a private economy. The next steps would require more than warrants and subpoenas. They would require people willing to tell the truth about what they had seen and what they had done. Mara stayed late at the archive, cataloguing the private posts and cross-referencing geotags. She made a list of the names that appeared most often and circled them. She printed the message thread with Cedar Watcher and placed it in an evidence folder. She wrote a note to herself in the margin, "Find Cedar Watcher. Find the hand." When she left the archive, the city was a quiet place of streetlights and distant sirens. She walked to her car with the Polaroid in her bag and the encrypted clip on a thumb drive. She felt the same small private ache Jonah had felt. She thought of Anna's line about windows and rooms and wondered which one Anna had been trying to live in. As she drove home, a notification lit her phone. A new comment on Anna Vera Official. Someone had posted a photograph of Anna at a private event, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes. The caption read, "She chose to stay." The comment thread below was a tangle of accusation and defense. Mara felt the city tilt under the weight of other people's certainty. She pulled over and stared at the screen. The photograph was new evidence and a provocation. Someone wanted the story to end in a particular way. Someone wanted the narrative to be tidy. Mara thought of Anna's private posts and the Polaroid in the tin box and the hand that had reached for the camera. She thought of the ledger and the trust and the way money could make silence a commodity. She texted Jonah a single line. "New photo posted." "Someone's pushing a narrative," he replied almost immediately. "Don't engage publicly. We'll handle it." His reply was a small, steady thing in the dark. They were moving through a landscape of curated images and private economies, of people who wanted to be seen and people who wanted to keep others unseen. The work ahead would require patience, legal muscle, and the kind of moral clarity that is hard to maintain when the public wants a story that fits a headline. Mara folded the Polaroid and slid it into her wallet. She thought of Anna's words, "I don't know if I can stop performing," and felt the urgency of the search like a pulse. The glass garden had given them a photograph and a tin box and a list of names. The ledger had given them a pattern. The private accounts had given them a voice. Somewhere in the city, someone was deciding whether to speak. Somewhere a hand had reached for a camera and then stopped. Mara started the car and drove into the night, the photograph warm against her thigh like a small, stubborn truth. The warrant arrived like a small, inevitable thunderclap. It was the kind of legal paper that made private rooms feel suddenly public, stamped, numbered, and carrying the authority of a judge who had read the affidavits and decided the state had cause. Jonah read it twice in the squad room, the fluorescent lights humming above, and felt the familiar mix of relief and dread. Relief because the law had given him a tool. Dread because tools can cut both ways. Victor Hale's estate sat on a quiet lane that pretended to be ordinary. A high hedge hid the house from the road. A stone path led to a door that opened onto a foyer with marble floors and a staircase that curved like a question. Jonah had been inside once before for a polite conversation that had felt like a negotiation. This time, the house felt different, less curated, more like a stage set that had been left mid-scene. The search team moved with the practiced choreography of people who had done this before. Officers in gloves, evidence techs with cameras, a DA representative taking notes. Victor's lawyer hovered at the edge of the room, like a man who had been trained to make every intrusion feel like an affront. He asked for copies of the warrant and for a list of items to be seized. Jonah let the legalities pass through him. He had learned to let lawyers do their work while he did his. The studio was in the basement, a converted space with soft lights and a backdrop that could be changed like a mood. There were chairs arranged in a semicircle, a small bar cart with decanters, and a shelf lined with Polaroids. Jonah felt the air change when he stepped into the room. The hush of a place designed for intimacy, the faint scent of cologne and old paper. He moved slowly, photographing everything. The Polaroids were the first thing that made his stomach tighten. They were small, square images, faces, hands, a shoulder, a profile, each with a note on the back. Some notes were mundane. June 12th, studio test. Others were more possessive, for the collection. Jonah handled them like relics, careful not to smudge the emulsion. One Polaroid caught his eye. Anna, seated on a chair, her head turned slightly, eyes not quite meeting the camera. On the back, in a hurried hand, were the words, "For the collection." A. The handwriting matched the note on the Polaroid from the glass garden. Jonah felt the room tilt. He bagged the photograph and moved on. On a table near the lights he found a ledger. It was not the neat corporate ledger of a business, but a private book, its pages filled with names, dates, and shorthand. Some names were circled, others were crossed out. Next to certain entries were amounts, cash, apparently, written in a small, precise hand. The ledger had the cadence of someone who wanted to remember and to control. Victor's lawyer protested. "These are consenting adults," he said. "These are artistic materials. You are treating art like a crime." His voice was smooth, practiced. The DA, Eleanor Park, did not argue with the lawyer's rhetoric. She simply noted the ledger and the Polaroids and asked for them to be catalogued. Jonah found a stack of envelopes on a shelf. Some were empty, some contained cash. One envelope had Anna's name on it. The handwriting was not Victor's. It was the same hurried hand Jonah had seen before. He bagged the envelope and felt the weight of it like a small, private accusation. Victor himself arrived mid-search, escorted by his lawyer. He was a man who had perfected the look of mild surprise. He wore a dark coat and a face that suggested he had been inconvenienced by the intrusion. He greeted Jonah with a measured nod. "I understand you're doing your job, detective," he said. "I hope you'll understand mine. I host salons. People come. They consent. They sign releases. This is art." Jonah looked at him and felt the friction between two worlds, the world of curated privacy and the world of public accountability. "We found Polaroids in a ledger," Jonah said. "We found envelopes with cash. We found a Polaroid of Anna. We have a hair match to someone who attended your events. We have witnesses who saw a man watching her in the glass garden. We have a taxi receipt. We have a tin box with a Polaroid she left for herself. We have a private message thread where someone calls themselves Cedar Watcher." Victor's face did not change. "You're connecting dots that may not belong together," he said. "People come to my events for many reasons. Some are artists, some are patrons, some are curious. That does not make me a criminal." The DA's representative, Elena, stepped in. "We're not accusing you of anything yet," she said, "but we need to understand the ledger and the payments. We need to know who signed releases and who was paid in cash. We need to know whether anyone was coerced." Victor's lawyer bristled. "You're asking for private records. You're asking for names of patrons who value discretion. You're asking for a breach of privacy." Elena's reply was quiet and firm. "We're asking for the truth." The search continued. Jonah found a small safe behind a false panel. Inside were more Polaroids, a stack of receipts, and a USB drive. He bagged the drive and felt the case deepen. The drive would be forensics. It would be a key if it contained video or audio. It might also be a dead end. For now, it was a promise. Back at the station, the forensics team worked through the night. The USB drive yielded a folder labeled Sessions. Inside were audio files and short video clips, some encrypted, some not. Jonah watched a clip that made his throat tighten. Anna in a studio, speaking to someone off camera. Her voice was steady but strained. She said, "I don't want to be a thing." The clip ended with a hand, gloved, reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. The audio files were more revealing. In one, a man's voice, low, measured, asked Anna to remove a piece of jewelry. She complied. In another, a woman's voice laughed softly as if at a private joke. The recordings were not explicit, but they were intimate in a way that made Jonah's skin crawl. He felt the line between consent and coercion blur in the dark. Victor's lawyer demanded the return of certain items and filed motions to limit the DA's use of the materials. The legal battle began to look like a second investigation. Subpoenas, motions, and the slow, strategic dance of lawyers who knew how to make time an ally. Jonah watched the legal maneuvers with a detective's impatience. He wanted to find Anna. He wanted to know whether she had been taken or whether she had chosen to stay. The law, he knew, would not always give him the moral clarity he craved. Meanwhile, Mara kept working the archive. She had found the Cedar Watcher thread and printed it out, but the handle was a ghost. No real name, no obvious identity. She cross-referenced the handle with comments on Victor's public posts and with the ledger entries. The ledger had shorthand that matched certain comments, initials, dates, and a symbol that looked like a small cedar leaf. The pattern suggested a signature, a mark of belonging. Mara also decrypted more of Anna's encrypted files. She found a short journal entry saved as a draft. "I am tired of being a window. I want a room. But rooms are expensive. People pay for windows." The line read like a small private scream. Mara felt the ache of it in her chest. She printed the entry and placed it in an evidence folder. That night, Jonah received a call from Priya. She had traced the trust's donors to a list of names that included a few familiar faces. A philanthropist who funded galleries, a developer with a taste for private salons, and a name Jonah recognized from a past case. A man who had been acquitted years ago but who still moved in the same circles. The trust's donors were not all villains. Some were people who liked to be seen as patrons of the arts. But the pattern of small transfers and cash envelopes suggested a system designed to keep things off the books. Jonah felt the case like a knot that tightened with every pull. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing," and of the ledger that listed names like inventory. He thought of the Polaroids and the envelopes and the man who smelled like cedar. He thought of the anonymous text that had told him to stop digging. The next morning, a reporter called the station. The story had leaked. Someone had posted a photograph of Anna at a private event with a caption that read, "She chose to stay." The photograph was cropped to make her smile look like consent. The internet, Jonah knew, loved tidy narratives. It loved to make victims into willing participants or to turn complex situations into moral fables. Jonah called Mara. "Don't engage publicly," he said. "We'll handle it." Mara's voice was steady. "I'm going to the glass garden," she said. "I want to talk to Rosa again. Maybe someone saw something else." Jonah wanted to tell her not to go alone, but he knew Mara's stubbornness. She had a way of moving through archives and gardens with the same careful hands. He asked her to text him when she left and when she returned. She promised. At the glass garden, Rosa was waiting on the bench, her cardigan buttoned to the throat. She had a thermos of tea and a look that suggested she had been expecting trouble. When Mara showed her the Polaroid from the studio, Rosa's face tightened. "She looked different in that photo," Rosa said, like someone had put a mask on her. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I saw her after one of those events once." She came to the garden and sat for a long time. She held a tin box. She opened it and looked at a photograph and then closed it again. She looked like she was trying to remember something. Mara asked about the tin box. Rosa described it, small, rusted, with a photograph inside. "She said she kept it for when she forgot who she was," Rosa said. "She said it like it was a prayer." Mara felt the photograph like a small, private relic. She asked Rosa if she had seen the watcher again. Rosa nodded. "He sat at the edge and watched," she said. "He never touched the plants? He just watched." Mara pressed for a description. Rosa gave the same sketch: a hat, a coat, a posture that kept its distance. She added one detail this time. The watcher sometimes carried a small leather notebook and would write in it while he watched. The image lodged in Mara's mind like a splinter. When Mara left the garden, she felt the city press in around her. She thought of the ledger and the Polaroids and the man who wrote in a leather notebook. She thought of Anna's private posts and the line about rooms and windows. She thought of the anonymous text that had told Jonah to stop digging. Back at the station, Jonah watched the forensics team work through the USB drive. They had found metadata that suggested some of the recordings had been edited, clips spliced together, audio levels adjusted. The editing suggested an intent to control the narrative, to present certain moments and hide others. Jonah felt the chill of that realization. If someone could edit a recording, they could shape a story. He also received a call from the lab. The hair match had returned more context. The man whose DNA matched the hair had a record of coercive behavior, but his file also showed he had been a paid consultant at several private events, security, logistics, that sort of thing. He had been seen at Victor's gatherings. He had been photographed in the background of several Polaroids. He was a node in the network. Jonah felt the case like a web. Each thread he pulled revealed more threads. The ledger suggested a system. The Polaroid suggested a collection. The trust suggested a mechanism for discretion. The recording suggested a way to shape consent. The question that haunted him was not only whether Anna had been taken, but whether the system had made her invisible in a way that made coercion possible. That night, Jonah sat at his kitchen table and watched the city lights blink. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing," and felt the urgency of it like a pulse. He thought of Mara in the garden and of Rosa's thermos of tea. He thought of the ledger and the envelopes and the man who wrote in a leather notebook. He turned his phone over and found a new message from an unknown number. "You're close. Be careful. Some people will do anything to keep their windows clean." The message was a warning and a taunt. Jonah felt the air in the room go thin. He called Mara. She answered on the second ring. "I'm fine," she said. "Rosa gave me a list of names. I'm going to cross-reference them with the ledger." "Don't go alone," Jonah said. "I won't," she replied. "But I'm not stopping." He wanted to tell her that the world they were poking at was dangerous in ways that were not always visible. He wanted to tell her that some people would prefer a tidy story to the messy truth. He wanted to tell her that the law could be blunt and slow, and that sometimes justice required more than evidence. It required courage. Instead, he said, "Text me when you get home." She promised. He hung up and stared at the phone until the screen dimmed. The case had moved from the edges into the center of a private economy that traded discretion for intimacy. The studio had been a room where images were made and where narratives could be edited. The ledger had been a record of names and dates. The Polaroids had been small, square witnesses. Jonah felt the weight of it like a hand on his chest. He thought of Anna's photograph in the tin box and of the line she had written in her private journal. "I am tired of being a window. I want a room." He thought of the man who smelled like cedar and the hand that had reached for the camera. The investigation had found a studio, a ledger, and a network. It had found a woman who had left herself a photograph and a note. It had found a city that could make a person both visible and invisible. The next steps would require more than warrants and subpoenas. They would require people willing to tell the truth about what they had seen and what they had done. As Jonah turned off the light and the apartment settled into the hush of the city night, he felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. He thought of the studio's soft lights and the ledger's precise hand. He thought of the Polaroids and the envelopes and the man who wrote in a leather notebook. Somewhere, someone was deciding whether to speak. Somewhere, a hand had reached for a camera and then stopped. Jonah closed his eyes and tried to imagine what Anna would say if she could speak without fear. He could not hear her voice clearly, only the echo of a line. "I don't want to be a thing." The echo stayed with him as he slept. And when he woke the next morning, the case had already moved another degree closer to the truth. Jonah had learned to read the small, private ways people betrayed themselves. A coffee ring on a ledger, a smudge on a sleeve, a hesitation before a name. These were the things that told him more than a confession ever could. The Anna Vera case had become a mosaic of such small betrayals. A Polaroid left in a tin box, a ledger with circled names, a private message that read like a dare. Tonight, the mosaic was beginning to show a pattern, but the pattern was not yet a picture. He sat in the interview room with a file open and a cup of coffee gone cold. The room smelled of disinfectant and paper. On the table lay a printout of the encrypted clip Mara had decrypted. Anna in a studio, the gloved hand reaching for the camera. Jonah had watched the clip until the edges blurred. He kept returning to the way Anna's voice had steadied itself before the hand intruded, as if she had rehearsed courage and then had it interrupted. Across town, Mara sat at her kitchen table with a stack of Anna's drafts and a notebook full of cross-references. The drafts were jagged and luminous, sentences that began as aphorisms and ended as confessions. I am tired of being a window. I want a room. Names are like windows. Some people look out. Some people look in. The lines read like a woman trying to map herself in language that would not betray her. Mara's life had been small and ordered until Anna's disappearance. She catalogued other people's histories for a living, but this case had made history feel urgent and dangerous. She had started the file because a comment on a public post had lodged in her mind. Now she found herself in the middle of a network that traded intimacy for discretion. The archive had taught her to be patient. The case was teaching her to be brave. Jonah's next interview was with a man named Elias Crane, a former events coordinator who had worked at Victor Hale's estate for several seasons. Elias was in his late 30s, with a face that had been softened by too many late nights and too much wine. He had the look of someone who had once believed in glamour and now believed only in invoices. Elias sat across from Jonah and folded his hands. He had been cooperative at first, but the ledger and the Polaroids had made him nervous. He spoke in a voice that tried to be casual and failed. We called them salons, he said. We billed them as private dinners, artistic gatherings. People came to see art, to be seen. Some of the guests were patrons. Some were collectors. Some were curious. We had rules, releases, confidentiality agreements. We tried to keep things above board. Jonah watched him. Were there ever times when someone felt pressured? Elias's mouth tightened. Pressure is a word. People are adults. They make choices. Sometimes those choices are complicated. We had a security consultant. He handled logistics. He made sure things ran smoothly. He also kept people in line when they got rowdy. I never saw him cross a line. But I heard things later. Rumors, people talk. Rumors about what? Elias looked away. That some people like to collect images. That some patrons like to keep mementos. That some women left with envelopes and then came back the next week. It's not my place to judge. I did my job, Jonah pressed. Did Anna ever seem uncomfortable? Elias hesitated. She was quiet. She smiled for the camera. She took direction. But there were nights when she would come back to the garden and sit for a long time. She looked like she was trying to remember something. I thought she was an artist who needed space. I didn't think... He stopped, the sentence collapsing into the room. Jonah left Elias with a list of follow-ups and a feeling that the man had been telling the truth as far as he could see it. People who work inside systems often see only the parts that touch them. The ledger, the Polaroids, the envelopes, those were the parts Jonah could see. The rest was a fog of intentions and private bargains. That evening, Jonah drove to a diner on the edge of the arts district where he had arranged to meet a woman named Tamsin Reed, a photographer who had once collaborated with Anna. Tamsin was blunt and quick, the kind of person who used her camera like a scalpel. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel exposed and, oddly, seen. Tamsin slid into the booth and ordered coffee. She had a camera bag slung over her shoulder like a talisman. Anna was brilliant, she said without preamble. She had an eye. She could make a corner of a room look like a cathedral. But she was also fragile. She wanted to be taken seriously and she wanted to be loved. Those two things don't always fit together. Did she ever talk about Victor Hale? Jonah asked. Tamsin's face hardened. Victor is a collector. He collects images and people who can be made into images. He has money and taste and a way of making people feel honored. But honor can be a cage. Anna did a shoot for him once. She told me afterward that she felt like she had been photographed into a costume. She said she had been paid and that she had signed a release, but she also said she felt like she had been given a role to play. Did she ever say she wanted to leave? Tamsin nodded. She talked about leaving the city. She talked about going somewhere quiet, where no one would expect her to perform. She said she wanted a room of her own, but leaving is expensive. People like Victor make it possible to stay and to be seen. It's complicated. Jonah listened and felt the complexity like a pressure in his chest. The ledger suggested a system that made staying profitable. The Polaroids suggested a collection that turned people into objects. The private messages suggested a man who wanted authenticity but only on his terms. The question that kept returning was whether Anna had been a willing participant who later regretted her choices, or whether the system had made her invisible in ways that made coercion possible. Meanwhile, Mara had a breakthrough. She had been cross-referencing the Cedar Watcher handle with comments and ledger shorthand when she noticed a pattern. The cedar leaf symbol that appeared in the ledger matched a watermark on a set of digital invitations sent to a small circle of patrons. The invitations were for intimate evenings at private locations, dinners, salons, studio nights. The watermark was subtle, a stylized cedar leaf in the corner, almost like a signature. Mara traced the invitations to an email server that used a privacy service. The server masked the senders' identities, but the invitations had been sent from a cluster of addresses that all routed through the same trust. The trust's donors matched the names Priya had found. The cedar leaf was a brand, a discreet mark that signaled membership in a private economy. She printed the invitations and circled the watermark. The cedar leaf felt like a brand for discretion, a way to say, you are inside, you are seen, and you will be kept invisible to the outside world. The brand made the ledger make sense. It made the Polaroids make sense. It made the anonymous text that told Jonah to stop digging make sense. Mara took the printouts to Jonah the next morning. He read them with a slow, careful attention.
"It's a club," he said.
A private club with a brand and a ledger and a way of keeping things off the books. And a way of making people feel special, Mara added. Which is how you get consent that's not really free, Jonah nodded. We need to find who runs the trust. We need to find the donors. We need to find the people who signed the releases and the people who were paid in cash. We need to know whether Anna left by choice or whether she was made to stay. They began to map the network like cartographers of a hidden city. Donors, patrons, coordinators, security consultants, venues. Each node had a name and a ledger entry and a set of small private rituals. The map was ugly and precise. It showed how discretion could be monetized and how intimacy could be commodified. That night, Jonah received a call that made his hands go cold. The lab had processed the USB drive further and found metadata that suggested some of the recordings had been edited after the fact. Someone had spliced clips together, removed context, and created a narrative. The editing suggested an intent to control the story, to present certain moments and hide others. If someone could edit recordings, they could shape consent. He thought of the gloved hand in the clip and of Anna's voice saying, "I don't want to be a thing." He thought of the ledger and the cedar leaf and the way money could make silence a commodity. He thought of the man who wrote in a leather notebook and the way he watched the garden. The next morning, Lila came to the station. She had been quiet since the first day Jonah had met her in Anna's apartment. Today she looked like someone who had been carrying a secret too long. She sat down and folded her hands. "I lied," she said without preamble. "I told you Anna left a note that said back soon. I said the door was locked from the inside."
"I lied because I wanted to protect her." Jonah leaned forward.
"Protect her from what?" Lila's eyes filled. "From people who would make her into something she wasn't. From people who would tell her she was lucky to be chosen. She told me about a man who wanted the parts of her that weren't for sale. She told me she was scared. I told her to be careful."
"I told her to hide. I thought I was helping. Why didn't you tell us sooner?"
"Because she asked me not to," Lila said. "She said she wanted to handle it. She said she didn't want to be a story. She said she wanted a room. I thought I could keep her safe by keeping quiet."
"I was wrong." Jonah felt the room tilt.
Lila's confession was a small human thing that complicated the neat categories of victim and willing participant. It suggested a woman who had tried to manage her own danger and had been failed by the very people who loved her. He asked Lila about the man she mentioned. She described a presence that matched Rosa's watcher and the man in the taxi footage: a hat, a coat, a leather notebook. She said Anna had called him M in a message once and had circled the initial in a notebook. Lila had seen the initial and had asked who it was. Anna had said, "Someone who keeps windows clean." Jonah wrote the initial down. M, he thought of the cedar leaf and the ledger, and the way initials could be a code for belonging. He thought of the man with the history of coercive behavior and the way the network had made him a node rather than an outlier. That night, Jonah drove past the glass garden and slowed. The place was quiet, the trellises like black skeletons against the sky. He thought of Anna's line, "I want a room," and felt the urgency of it like a pulse. He thought of the ledger and the cedar leaf and the way money could make silence a commodity. He parked and sat for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. He felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. He thought of the gloved hand and the edited clips and the man who wrote in a leather notebook. He thought of the people who had tried to protect Anna by keeping her secrets and of the people who had profited from her visibility. Somewhere, someone was deciding whether to speak. Somewhere, a ledger was being updated. Somewhere, a hand had reached for a camera and then stopped. Jonah turned the key and drove home, the night pressing close. The map they were drawing had more nodes than they had imagined, and each node was a mirror that reflected a different version of the truth. The ledger was a small, ugly thing when Jonah first saw it in the evidence room, a battered notebook with a cracked spine, pages that smelled faintly of smoke and old ink. Up close, the handwriting was neat and economical: initials, dates, shorthand. It looked like bookkeeping for someone who wanted to remember without being remembered. Priya had called it a map. Jonah thought of it as a ledger of favors and debts, a private economy written in pencil. Priya worked like a woman who loved puzzles. She sat at a bank of monitors, fingers moving over keys with the ease of someone who had taught machines to tell secrets. She had traced the trust's donors to a cluster of accounts, each feeding small cash disbursements to vendors and envelopes labeled with initials. The cedar leaf watermark that Mara had found on the invitations appeared again in the ledger, tiny, penciled beside certain names. The symbol was a brand and a seal. "It's not just one patron," Priya said.
It's a network.
Small transfers, cash payouts, invoices that read like art services. The trust is the hub. The donors are nodes. The ledger is the ledger of the hub. Whoever runs the trust keeps the books tidy and the patrons anonymous. Jonah leaned over the screen. "Who are the donors?" Priya scrolled. "A gallery benefactor, a developer, a foundation director, a name that pops up in the old case files. Hargrove." She paused. "And a few shell entities that route through the same mailbox. The money moves in ways designed to avoid scrutiny." Hargrove's name made Jonah's stomach tighten. He had seen Hargrove's face in courtrooms and charity galas, a man who wore philanthropy like a coat. Hargrove had been acquitted years ago in a case that had left Jonah with a bruise of doubt he could not shake. The ledger's penciled initials and the cedar leaf suggested a system that let men like Hargrove remain patrons while keeping the ledger's darker pages private. Priya pulled up a scanned invoice. It was for a private salon and listed a catering company, a studio rental, and a line item, collection services. The invoice was billed to the trust and paid in cash. The vendor's signature matched a name Jonah had seen in the maintenance logs at Victor Hale's estate. The network was not elegant. It was efficient. "We need to subpoena the trust records," Jonah said. "We need to know who authorized the payments and who signed the releases." Elena Park, the DA, agreed, but warned him that the legal fight would be long. "These are wealthy people with lawyers who know how to bury things in corporate structures," she said. "We can get warrants, but we need to be precise. We need to show probable cause that the money funded illegal activity, not just private gatherings. Probable cause required more than ledgers. It required testimony, corroboration, and a narrative that tied the money to coercion. Jonah felt the pressure of that legal threshold like a physical thing. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing," and of the ledger's neat pencil marks. The law could catalogue transactions. It could not always capture the moral economy that turned intimacy into currency. Mara kept working the archive side of the case. She had found the cedar watermark on invitations and the ledger's initials, but she wanted to know how the invitations were distributed. She traced the email server through a privacy service and found a pattern. Invitations sent from a rotating set of addresses, each routed through the trust's mailbox. The invitations were curated, with guest lists that read like a who's who of the city's private circles. She also found a small forum, an encrypted message board used by patrons to coordinate events. The board was a closed loop, accessible only by invitation. Mara could not crack it from the archive, but she found a breadcrumb, a username that matched the cedar leaf watermark. The username posted about intimate evenings and preserving moments. The tone was casual, almost bored. The posts treated people like objects to be arranged. Mara printed the posts and took them to Jonah. "They talk like they're shopping," she said, "like they're curating a collection." Jonah read the printouts and felt the same coldness he had felt in the studio. The ledger, the invitations, the forum, they all pointed to a market where discretion was the product and people were the inventory. The question was how to prove that the market had crossed into coercion. They began to interview women who had attended the salons. Some spoke with the language of empowerment. They had been paid, they had consented, they had enjoyed the attention. Others spoke with a different vocabulary: pressure, small humiliations, the sense of being chosen and then owned. The testimonies were messy and contradictory, which made them human and therefore harder to use in court. One woman, a model named Sarah, agreed to speak on the record. She had been photographed at Victor's estate and had later taken her images down from public feeds. She sat in the DA's conference room with her hands folded and her voice steady. "I thought it was an opportunity," she said. "I thought it would help my career. They paid well. They were flattering. But there were moments when I felt like I was being rehearsed into a role. They would ask me to smile in a certain way, to tilt my head, to look grateful. It's subtle. It's not violence in the way people imagine. It's a pressure that accumulates. Did you ever feel coerced?" Jonah asked. Sarah hesitated. Not at first. But later, when I asked for more money or to stop certain things, the tone changed. They would remind me of favors, of introductions, of how being difficult could cost me opportunities. It's a slow economy of favors and threats. Her testimony was a thread. It did not prove coercion by itself, but it showed how the ledger's small transactions could become leverage. The trust paid vendors. Vendors paid performers. Patrons expected returns. The returns were not always financial. They were introductions, reputation, and the quiet threat of being excluded. Priya found a pattern in the trust's disbursements. Payments clustered around certain dates that matched ledger entries and Polaroid notes. Some payments were labelled studio fee. Others were labelled collection. The language was evasive. The money moved like a tide, and the ledger recorded the ebb and flow. Jonah and Mara began to map the ledger against the city's social calendar. Gallery openings, charity dinners, private salons. The ledger's circled names corresponded to nights when private events had been held. The cedar leaf watermark appeared on invitations for the same nights. The pattern suggested a choreography: invitations sent, events held, photographs taken, envelopes exchanged. They also found a darker pattern. A small cluster of ledger entries corresponded to women who later posted about feeling off or tired in private accounts. The posts were brief and elliptical, lines about needing to sleep, about feeling like a costume. The posts were the kind of thing people write when they are trying to name a feeling without naming the cause. Mara found one such post that cut through the fog. It was a private caption Anna had written months before she disappeared. They call it being chosen.
It feels like being catalogued.
The line read like a diagnosis. Mara felt the sentence like a small, sharp thing. They followed the money further. Priya traced a series of cash withdrawals to a man named Marcus Hale, no relation to Victor, who ran logistics for private events. Marcus had a record as a consultant and a history of working security at exclusive gatherings. He had been photographed in the background of several Polaroids. His name appeared in the ledger as a payee for collection services. Jonah brought Marcus in for questioning. Marcus was a man who had learned to make his voice sound like a neutral instrument. He answered questions with the practiced calm of someone who had been coached. "We provided logistics," he said. "We handled guest lists, security, transport. We made sure things ran smoothly. People paid for discretion. That's the business. Did you ever move people against their will?" Jonah asked. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "No, people come voluntarily. They sign releases. They are paid. If someone felt uncomfortable, they could leave. We had protocols," Jonah pressed. "Were there ever times when someone was pressured to stay? When someone was paid to be quiet?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "There are always negotiations. People want to be seen.
People want to be chosen.
Sometimes that comes with strings, but we didn't force anyone." The interview left Jonah with a sense of the system's plausible deniability. Marcus's answers were true in the narrow sense. People did sign releases. Money did change hands. But the ledger and the testimonies suggested a moral economy where consent could be manufactured by incentives and exclusion. That night, Jonah and Mara sat in the evidence room and spread the ledger's photocopies across the table. They drew lines between names and dates, circled the cedar leaf, and annotated the map with witness statements. The map looked like a spiderweb, beautiful in its geometry, ugly in its implication. Mara tapped a name. "Hargrove," she said.
He's on the donor list.
"He's on the trust board. He's a patron who likes to be invisible." Jonah rubbed his forehead. "If Hargrove is involved, the legal fight will be brutal. He has resources and lawyers. But if we can tie him to payments that funded coercive practices, we have something." They needed a smoking gun, a document, a recording, a ledger entry that explicitly linked money to coercion. The ledger was circumstantial. The Polaroids were intimate but ambiguous. The recordings were edited. The testimonies were messy. The law required a narrative that could be presented in court. Priya found a small, promising anomaly. A vendor had submitted an expense report that included a line item for transport and storage with a handwritten note, boxes labelled for preservation. The boxes had been stored at a warehouse that serviced Victor's estate. The warehouse manifest listed a tin box with a Polaroid and a note for memory. The manifest had been signed by a logistics coordinator, Marcus's signature. The tin box was the same motif that had appeared in the glass garden. The Polaroid inside had been Anna's. The manifest suggested someone had catalogued and stored personal items as if they were artifacts. The language, preservation, memory, sounded like euphemism for possession. Jonah felt the hairs on his arms rise. The manifest was not a confession, but it was a paper trail that connected the ledger, the logistics, and the physical artifacts. It suggested that the private economy had a storage system and that items, photographs, boxes, notes, were being archived. They subpoenaed the warehouse manifest and the storage unit. The unit was dusty and smelled of cardboard and old paper. Inside were boxes labelled with initials and dates. One box contained a tin box with a Polaroid and a folded note, "For when I forget who I am." The handwriting matched Anna's. The discovery was a small, human thing that made the ledger's cold lines feel like a wound. The tin box was not evidence of a single crime. It was evidence of a system that treated people like objects to be preserved. It was a thing that could be shown to a jury and that could make the ledger's pencil marks feel like more than numbers. When Jonah presented the manifest and the tin box to the DA, Elena's face softened. "This is the kind of connective tissue we need," she said. "It ties the ledger to physical artifacts and to the logistics network. It doesn't prove coercion by itself, but it gives us a narrative to build on." They began to build that narrative. They subpoenaed donor records, storage manifests, and guest lists. They interviewed women who had been photographed and asked them to describe the moments before and after the shoots. They asked about envelopes, about favors, about the pressure of being chosen. The testimonies were messy and human, and that messiness made the case harder to prosecute, but also more real. As they worked, Jonah felt the moral weight of the ledger like a hand on his shoulder. The money garden had been cultivated carefully, invitations sent, events staged, photographs taken, artifacts stored. The trust had been the irrigation system, moving funds quietly. The patrons had been the gardeners, choosing what to cultivate. The women had been the plants, tended, arranged, sometimes pruned. He thought of Anna's line, "They call it being chosen."
It feels like being catalogued.
He thought of the tin box and the Polaroid and the ledger's penciled cedar leaf. He thought of the men who liked to be invisible and the women who had been made visible for a price. The case was no longer only about a missing woman. It was about a market that monetized intimacy and a community that had allowed discretion to become a currency. It was about the ways people can be made to feel grateful for being chosen and the ways gratitude can be turned into leverage. Late one night, as Jonah reviewed the manifest and the ledger, his phone buzzed.
It was a message from an unknown number. "You're getting close."
"Stop before you hurt someone who doesn't deserve it." The message was a threat and a plea. Jonah stared at the screen and felt the ledger's lines blur. The money garden had thorns as well as fruit. He put the phone down and looked at the tin box photograph again.
Anna's smile in the Polaroid was small and private.
It was not the curated smile of the public account. It was a face that belonged to a person who had tried to remember herself. Jonah folded the photograph and placed it in an evidence envelope. The money garden had given them a trail. Now they had to follow it without trampling the people who had been hurt along the way. They called it the glass garden because, in the right light, the trellises and the lemon trees and the string lights made the place look like a greenhouse of small, private things. At night, it was a different animal. Shadows pooled between the plots, benches became islands, and the city's distant hum turned into a single, watchful breath. Jonah had been there in daylight and felt the place's gentle ordinariness. At night, it felt like a place that kept its own counsel. They decided to watch from the edges. Jonah and Mara set up in a car 2 blocks away, the engine off, the heater ticking as it cooled. Mara had insisted on the stakeout. She wanted to see the garden in the hours Anna had favored. Jonah had wanted to keep her safe. They compromised. Mara would sit in the car with Jonah until dusk, then walk the perimeter with a flashlight, while Jonah stayed in the shadows. They both knew the risk. Someone had already sent Jonah a warning text, but the case had a gravity that made caution feel like cowardice. Rosa had left a thermos of tea on the bench and a note. "If he comes,
don't run."
He likes to see people run. The note read like a small, practical prayer. Jonah folded it into his pocket and watched the garden through the windshield. The lemon tree's silhouette looked like a small, patient thing. At first, nothing happened. A couple walked their dog past the hedge. A delivery truck idled at the far end of the lane. The garden's lights blinked like a constellation. Jonah and Mara talked in low voices about the ledger and the manifest, and the way the tin box had travelled from bench to warehouse to evidence bag. They tried to make the night feel like work and not like a trap. Around 11, a figure moved along the garden's edge. Jonah saw the hat first, a low brim that cut his face into shadow, and then the coat, the slow, measured gait. The watcher. Jonah's breath narrowed. He thumbed his radio and sent a quiet message to the squad. Possible watcher at Glass Garden. Observing. Do not approach without backup. He kept his voice steady, the way a man keeps his hands steady when he is about to lift something fragile. Mara slipped out of the car with a small flashlight and a recorder. She moved like someone who had learned to be careful with other people's stories. Jonah watched her go and felt the old, familiar tug of responsibility. He wanted to call her back, to tell her to get into the car and drive away. But he also knew that Mara's stubbornness was part of what had found Anna's trail in the first place. Mara walked the path between plots, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the dark. She kept her steps soft, her breath measured. The watcher sat on a low wall, a leather notebook open on his knee, writing in a hand that looked like it had been trained to be neat. He did not look up when Mara approached. He only tilted his head as if to measure her by the light. "Evening," Mara said, keeping her voice light. "Beautiful night for Basil." The man's voice was low and careful. "It's a good night for remembering," he said. He did not offer a name. He had the kind of voice that made small talk sound like a negotiation. Mara kept the flashlight steady. "You come here often?" He smiled without humor. "I come where things are kept tidy." He tapped the notebook. "People like to be catalogued." Mara felt the air go thin. She had read the ledger and the invitations and the forum posts. She had seen the cedar leaf watermark. She had not expected to meet the watcher in person. She kept her recorder in her pocket and asked the questions she had rehearsed in the archive, about the garden, about Anna, about the tin box. He answered in fragments, polite, evasive. He mentioned a name that matched an initial in the ledger, M. He said he liked to watch because watching was a way to keep things from being ruined. He said it with the calm of someone who had practiced the language of possession until it sounded like care. Mara felt a prickle at the back of her neck. She asked him if he had seen Anna the night she disappeared. He hesitated, then said, "I saw her leave with a man." They walked toward the warehouses. She looked like she had been rehearsing a smile. He tapped his notebook as if to underline the memory. She had a tin box. She kept it close. Mara's pulse quickened. "Did you see who the man was?" He looked at her then, and for the first time his face shifted. The hat's brim did not hide the line of his jaw or the small scar at the corner of his mouth. He said, "I don't give names."
Names make people into things. He closed the notebook and stood.
"You should go home." Mara felt the warning in his voice like a physical thing. She thanked him and walked back toward the car, the beam of her flashlight jittering. She kept her steps steady, but she felt watched in a way that made her skin crawl. When she reached the car, Jonah's hand was on the door before she could open it. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but her hands were trembling.
He said he had a scar. Jonah's jaw tightened.
He had seen that scar before, in a photograph from an old case file. It belonged to a man who had been acquitted years ago, Hargrove's associate, the one who had slipped through the legal net. Jonah had thought the man had receded into the city's background. Seeing the scar in the garden made the ledger's lines feel like a trap. They drove away slowly, keeping the garden in the rear view like a small, private wound. Mara's phone buzzed as they pulled onto the main road. A text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have come alone. We told you to stop." The message had no signature. Jonah felt the air in the car go thin. They reported the encounter and the text. Backup was dispatched to the garden to canvass for the watcher, but the man had vanished like a shadow. The gardeners said they had seen someone leave toward the warehouses. The maintenance worker's memory fit the pattern. A man in a hat, a tin box, a cab. The city's night swallowed the trail. Mara insisted on walking home. Jonah argued and then relented. He could not make her stop being who she was. He followed at a distance, the streetlights making halos around the trees. Halfway down the block, A car pulled up behind her and idled. A man in the passenger seat leaned out and called her name. "Mara," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't poke at things you don't understand." She kept walking. He called again, closer this time, and the car's engine revved as if to make a point. Mara's steps quickened. Jonah closed the distance and put himself between her and the car. The passenger rolled down the window and the man inside smiled like someone who had practiced menace. "You're making trouble," he said.
You're making people nervous. Jonah's voice was steady.
"You need to move on," the man laughed, a small, sharp sound. "You don't know what you're touching, detective. Some windows are meant to stay clean." He slammed the car into gear and peeled away, tires squealing. Jonah watched the taillights disappear and felt the old, familiar anger rise. Someone had crossed a line. Someone had sent a message. When Mara got home, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a Polaroid, new, glossy, the emulsion still warm from the printer. It showed Anna, seated in a studio, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes. Beside her, half in shadow, was a man Jonah recognized, the scar at the corner of his mouth, the way he held himself like a man who had been taught to own rooms. The back of the Polaroid had a single line in a hurried hand. She chose to stay. "Remember that?" Mara's hands shook as she called Jonah. He came over within minutes, the city's night a blur behind him. They sat at her kitchen table and spread the Polaroid between them like a small, accusing thing. Jonah traced the scar with his finger and felt the old case's weight settle into his bones. "This is Hargrove's man," Jonah said. "He's been in Victor's orbit."
He's been at the events.
"He's a node," Mara swallowed.
Why send this to me?
Jonah's face was a map of concentration. To intimidate, to tell us the narrative they want, that Anna stayed by choice, to make witnesses doubt themselves.
To make us stop. They both knew the tactic.
Powerful networks do not only hide evidence, they shape stories. They plant photographs, they leak narratives, they make the public see what they want. The Polaroid was a weapon as much as it was a clue. Jonah called Elena and Priya and asked for a warrant to search storage units associated with Marcus and the logistics network. He asked for surveillance footage from the warehouses and for a list of guests at Victor's Salons. He asked for protection for Mara. The legal machinery began to move, slow and deliberate, but it moved. That night, Jonah sat on Mara's couch and watched the city lights blink. He thought of the watcher in the garden and the scar that had made the ledger's initials feel like a threat. He thought of the tin box and the Polaroid, and the way the network had learned to make silence a commodity. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing," and felt the urgency of it like a pulse. Outside, the glass garden slept. Inside, the city kept its own counsel. Jonah knew the next moves would be dangerous. Raids, subpoenas, confrontations with men who had learned to make their power invisible. He also knew that the Polaroid had given them something they needed: a face, a scar, a link to a man who had been a ghost in his past. He folded the Polaroid and placed it in an evidence envelope. The photograph would be for the DA, for the forensics team, for the ledger of the case. But it was also a small private thing that would sit in his pocket like a promise. They would not let the narrative be shaped by those who profited from silence. As he left Mara's apartment, Jonah looked back at the street and thought of the watcher's leather notebook. He imagined the pages filled with names and dates, with small, neat handwriting that turned people into inventory. He imagined the ledger's cedar leaf stamped on invitations like a seal. Someone had sent a message. Stop. Someone had tried to tidy the windows. Jonah felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. He drove back to the station with the Polaroid in the glove compartment and the city's night pressing close, knowing that the next dawn would bring subpoenas, warrants, and the kind of legal fights that could bruise careers and reputations. But he also knew that the truth had a way of finding light. The glass garden had given them a photograph and a tin box and a watcher with a scar. The ledger had given them a map. The network had shown its edges. Now it was time to pull at the threads and see what came loose. Jonah had a file drawer in his head where old cases lived like ghosts, cases he visited when the present needed context. The man with the scar had been one of those ghosts, a silhouette in a photograph from a decade-old investigation that had ended with acquittals and a taste of unfinished justice. Seeing that scar in the glass garden had reopened an old ache. Tonight, Jonah wanted answers that were not just new evidence, but a reckoning with the past. He drove to a neighborhood where the city's edges frayed into warehouses and low brick buildings. The man he wanted to see, Caleb Hargrove's associate, known in old files as Marcus Vale, kept a low profile. But Jonah had learned that people who hide in plain sight often leave traces, a utility bill, a delivery receipt, a name on a ledger. He found Marcus at a small repair shop that smelled of oil and metal, leaning over a motorcycle with the same careful hands he'd used to sign manifests and coordinate logistics. Marcus looked up when Jonah introduced himself. He wiped his hands on a rag and offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Detective Hale," he said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Jonah sat on a stool and placed a photograph on the counter, the Polaroid with the scarred man half in shadow. Marcus's face did not change. He glanced at the image, then at Jonah, and folded his hands. "You know me," Marcus said. "You know I work logistics."
I move things. I don't make people do things. People say you keep lists, Jonah said.
"You sign manifests."
You store boxes.
"You move envelopes." "You're a node in a network that keeps things tidy." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I keep things moving."
People pay for discretion.
"That's the business. Did you see Anna the night she disappeared?" Jonah asked. Marcus's eyes flicked to the window as if measuring escape routes.
I saw a woman leave in a cab. I saw a man with a hat. I signed a manifest for a box that night. I don't know what was in it. I don't ask. Jonah watched him.
The man's answers were true in the narrow sense. He had signed manifests, he had moved boxes, but they were also evasive. Jonah had learned that evasions often hid the shape of a system. "You worked with Hargrove," Jonah said. "You were at Victor's events." "You know the ledger?" Marcus's face hardened.
I know how to do my job.
"I don't make moral judgments." Jonah left with the sense that Marcus had told him everything he wanted to tell and nothing he needed to. The ledger's lines had become a lattice of plausible deniability. People who did the work, people who paid, people who benefited. The law could chase transactions. It could not always chase the moral calculus that made those transactions possible. Back at the archive, Mara had been working through Anna's alias history like a detective of language. Names, she had learned, were not just labels, but strategies. Anna had used several. Anna Vera for the public portfolio, a different surname for a freelance billing account, and a third, her birth name, only in the drafts she never posted. Mara had found a pattern in the aliases. Each name corresponded to a different audience, a different set of expectations. The public name was a window. The private name was a room. Mara sat with a stack of printouts and a mug of tea gone cold. She had found an old rental agreement under Anna's birth name for a small apartment in a coastal town 3 hours away. The lease had been short, 2 months, and the dates overlapped with a lull in Anna's public posts. The rental agreement suggested a plan, a place to go, a room to inhabit. But the plan had been interrupted. She cross-referenced the rental dates with Anna's private messages and found a thread that had been deleted from the public feed, but preserved in a draft folder. In it, Anna had written to someone she called M. "I'm trying to leave."
I have a room. I have a plan. I'm scared you'll make me a thing again.
The message ended with a line that read like a plea. "If I go, will you let me be a person?" Mara felt the words like a small private wound. The message suggested a woman who had tried to escape and had asked for a promise. The initial M matched the ledger's shorthand and the watcher's reference. The draft had never been sent. Someone had kept the message in a folder like a prayer. She took the printouts to Jonah. He read them with a slow, careful attention. She tried to leave, he said. She had a plan. She asked for a promise. And she kept a room in her head, Mara added. She wrote about windows and rooms like they were different currencies. Jonah thought of Lila's confession and the way loyalty had become a kind of silence. He thought of Rose's thermos and the watcher's leather notebook. The case was no longer only about a missing person. It was about promises broken and bargains made in the dark. That afternoon, Lila came to the station again. She had been quiet since her first confession, but today she looked like someone who had been carrying a weight too long. She sat across from Jonah and folded her hands. "I lied about the note," she said. "I said it said back soon." "It didn't. It said I'm leaving."
Don't look for me. I told you the door was locked from the inside because I wanted to protect her.
"I thought if people thought she left by choice, they'd stop looking and she could go." Jonah felt the room tilt. "Why didn't you tell us that before?" "Because she asked me not to," Lila said. "She said she wanted to leave quietly. She said she didn't want to be a story. She said she wanted a room."
I thought I could help her by lying. I thought I could keep her safe. Did she tell you who M was?
Jonah asked. Lila's eyes filled. "She said the initial ones. She said he kept windows clean. She said he made people feel chosen. She said she was scared of what being chosen meant." Jonah wrote the initial down again. M. He thought of the cedar leaf watermark and the ledger's penciled marks. He thought of the man with the scar and the way Marcus had signed manifests. The initial was a thread that ran through the ledger like a seam. That evening, a new witness came forward, unexpected and dangerous. A woman named Elise Moran, who had once been a peripheral figure in Victor's circle, contacted the DA's office and asked to speak. Elise had been at several salons years ago and had left the scene when she felt the moral cost outweigh the benefits. She had been quiet for a long time, but guilt had a way of making people speak. Elise's testimony complicated the narrative. She told a story of a private project, an artistic series that promised to reveal truth and that paid well. She said Anna had been invited to participate and had been told the project would be empowering. Elise described a scene where Anna had been photographed in a studio, asked to perform vulnerability, and then paid in cash with a promise of introductions and future work. "She seemed excited at first," Elise said, "but later she looked like she had been rehearsed into a role. She would come back to the garden and sit for hours. She would look at a photograph and cry. I thought she had chosen to stay because she wanted the work. But later I realized she had been trapped by the promise of a future that never came." Elise's words were a pivot. They suggested that Anna had initially consented, drawn by the promise of art and opportunity, but that consent had been eroded by a system that traded favors and withheld futures. The testimony blurred the line between willing participation and coercion by attrition. Not everyone accepted Elise's account.
A man who had attended salons and who had been photographed with Anna came forward to say he had seen Anna leave willingly on the night in question.
He produced a photograph, one of the many that had been circulated online, showing Anna smiling at a table. "She chose to stay," he said. "She was an adult."
She made choices. The public loved tidy narratives.
The photograph was a tidy thing, a frozen smile that could be read as consent. The internet seized on it and divided into camps, those who insisted Anna had chosen to stay and those who insisted she had been taken. The ledger and the tin box and the Polaroids were messy. The photograph was neat. Mara felt the pull of both truths. She had Anna's drafts and the rental agreement and the private messages. She had the Polaroid in the tin box and the ledger's penciled cedar leaf. She also had the knowledge that people can make choices under pressure, and that choices made under pressure are not always free. Late that night, as the city slept, a package arrived at the DA's office. It was unmarked and left on the steps like a thing someone wanted to be found but not traced. Inside was a small notebook, leather, worn at the edges, and a photocopy of a journal page. The handwriting was Anna's. Mara read the page with a kind of reverence. The entry was short and jagged, the sentences like breathless steps.
I have a room booked. I have a plan. I will leave on the 3rd.
I will take the tin box.
I will not be a window. I will be a room.
If I cannot be a room, I will... And then the line stopped, the sentence unfinished, the ink trailing into a smear as if the pen had been dropped. The unfinished sentence was a cliff. It suggested a plan interrupted, a voice cut off mid-thought. Mara felt the ache of it like a physical thing. The journal page was not a confession or a legal document. It was a human fragment that made the ledger's pencil marks feel like a wound. Jonah and Mara sat with the photocopy in the DA's conference room and felt the case shift again. The journal suggested that Anna had tried to leave and had been interrupted. Elise's testimony suggested that consent had been eroded by promises. Lila's confession suggested that those closest to Anna had tried to protect her by keeping secrets. The photograph that the public loved suggested a tidy narrative that might not be true. The threads were tangled. The ledger suggested a system. The Polaroid suggested a collection. The tin box suggested a private ritual of memory. The journal suggested a plan that had been cut short. The man with the scar suggested a node who had been present in the network. The anonymous texts suggested people who wanted the investigation to stop. Jonah felt the pressure of the past and the present pressing together. He thought of the old case that had left him with a bruise of doubt, and of the way powerful men could make their windows clean by paying others to look away. He thought of Anna's unfinished sentence and the way a life could be interrupted in the middle of a plan. He left the DA's office with a list of new subpoenas and a sense that the case had reached a hinge. Someone in the network had decided to push a narrative. Anna had chosen to stay. Someone else had decided to send a notebook and a photocopy of a journal page that suggested the opposite. The truth, Jonah knew, would not be tidy. It would be a mosaic of fragments that, when placed together, might show a picture that no one wanted to see. As he drove through the city, the ledger's lines and the journal's unfinished sentence played in his head like a refrain. He thought of the watcher in the garden and the man with the scar and the way Marcus had signed manifests. He thought of the cedar leaf watermark and the trust's donors and the way money could make silence a commodity. Somewhere in the city, someone was deciding whether to speak. Somewhere, a ledger was being updated. Somewhere, a hand had reached for a camera and then stopped. Jonah felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and drove toward the next thread, knowing that each answer would bring new questions and that the truth, when it came, would be complicated and necessary. The ledger had become a kind of map that everyone in the case read differently. To Jonah, it was a lattice of transactions and dates. To Mara, it was a catalogue of small violences. To the DA, it was a thread that might be pulled until the whole fabric unravelled. Now, with subpoenas served and storage units opened, the ledger's penciled cedar leaves and circled initials began to point to rooms and boxes and recordings that had been kept precisely because someone wanted to remember and someone else wanted to own the memory, the secondary location they had. Raided was a converted loft above a shuttered print shop. A place that smelled of dust and solvent and the faint sweetness of old paper. It had been rented under a shell company name, the kind of corporate fiction that made accountability slow and expensive. Inside, the search team found a studio set up like a private theatre. Soft lights, a backdrop, a row of chairs, and a shelf of Polaroids arranged like a private museum. On a table lay a small stack of audio files burned to CDs, labelled in the same neat hand as the ledger. Jonah handled the CDs with the same care he had used on the Polaroids. Forensics would make copies. The originals would be catalogued. He felt the weight of the room like a hand on his shoulder. The studio had been a place where images were made and where narratives could be edited. The CDs were a promise of context if they contained what the ledger suggested. Back at the station, the forensics team worked through the night. The audio files were messy at first. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of people in a room. Then a voice, Anna's, cut through the noise. She spoke in a low, steady tone, answering a question off camera. Her voice was not the curated voice of the public account. It was raw, threaded with fatigue. "I don't want to be a thing," she said in one clip. "I want to be a person," a man's voice answered, low, measured, the voice Jonah had heard in other recordings. "You are a person," he said, "but people like to collect things. They like to remember. We preserve what matters." There was a pause, the sound of a chair scraping.
Anna's breath.
Then a different voice, a woman's, laughing softly as if at a private joke. The recording shifted. A hand moved, a rustle of fabric, a camera shutter.
Anna's voice returned, quieter.
"Please," she said.
"Please don't." The clip ended with a sound that made Jonah's stomach drop. A sharp intake of breath, a muffled noise, and then a scream that cut off mid-word.
The audio went silent. Jonah replayed the clip until the edges blurred. The scream was not cinematic. It was immediate and human and cut off as if someone had hit a button. The silence that followed was a presence in itself. Forensics could enhance and isolate and perhaps find context, but the rawness of that cut, Anna's voice, the plea, the scream, was a thing that lodged in the chest. Elena Park called a meeting. The DA's conference room filled with the people who had been moving the case forward. Jonah, Mara, Priya, the lead forensics tech, and a prosecutor who specialized in coercion and trafficking cases. The audio was played once, in full, with the volume low enough to keep the room from feeling like a theater, and loud enough that everyone heard the same thing. When the clip ended, no one spoke for a long time. The silence was a kind of verdict. The prosecutor, a woman named Dana, leaned forward and said, "This is not proof of a single crime by itself, but it is evidence of a context. It shows a dynamic. It shows a moment where a person asked to stop and was interrupted. That's important." Victor Hale's lawyer called the DA's office within the hour and demanded a preservation order for all materials in Victor's possession. He framed the recordings as artistic experiments and accused the DA of a witch hunt. The public, meanwhile, had already begun to fracture into camps, those who saw the audio as proof of coercion and those who insisted it was edited, taken out of context, or even fabricated. Jonah felt the pressure of both the legal and the public arenas. The audio had given them a moment that could not be unseen. It had also made the case more dangerous. Powerful people do not like being exposed. They like their windows clean. The ledger had been a map. The audio was a wound.
Mara kept working the archive.
She had been cataloguing Anna's drafts and private posts, cross-referencing them with the ledger and the audio timestamps. She found a short note in Anna's drafts that matched the cadence of the plea on the recording. "If I say, 'Stop,' let it stop. If I say, 'Leave,' leave." The line read like a plea for a basic human boundary. They began to call witnesses. Some women who had been photographed at Victor's salons agreed to speak. Their testimonies were varied and complicated. One woman, a performance artist named Lila, not Anna's sister, described the salons as a place where she had felt both empowered and objectified.
"They paid me to be vulnerable," she said.
They framed it as art. But there were moments when the line between performance and pressure blurred. You start to feel like your choices are only choices because someone else gives you the option. Another woman, a model who had once been photographed by Victor, refused to speak on the record. She sent a statement through a lawyer that read, "I consented to be photographed.
I do not wish to relive the experience in public."
The statement was a reminder that consent is not a single moment but a series of negotiations, and that people's relationships to those negotiations can change. Elise Moran, who had come forward earlier, agreed to testify in a closed session. She described the ledger as a bookkeeping of favors and the trust as a mechanism that turned discretion into currency. They would promise introductions and future work, she said. They would pay in cash and then make you feel grateful. Gratitude is a leash. The DA's team began to build a narrative that would connect the ledger, the trust, the storage manifests, and the audio. They sought to show that the private economy had a structure: invitations, events, photographs, envelopes, storage, and a culture of plausible deniability. The legal theory was that the system had been used to coerce and to silence, not necessarily by a single violent act, but by a pattern of pressure and leverage. Victor's defense countered with a different narrative: art, consent, and the right of adults to make choices. His lawyer argued that the recordings were ambiguous, that the audio could be edited, and that the ledger's shorthand did not prove criminal intent. The courtroom of public opinion echoed the same arguments. The internet debated whether Anna had been a victim or an agent, and the debate often ignored the messy middle where most human lives live. Jonah felt the moral complexity like a bruise. He had the audio clip and the tin box and the Polaroids and the ledger. He had witnesses who said they had been pressured, and witnesses who said they had consented. He had a man with a scar who had been seen in the garden, and a logistics coordinator who signed manifests, and a trust that funneled money through shell accounts. He had a city that wanted a tidy story and a woman who had left an unfinished sentence in a journal. Then, in the middle of the legal wrangling, a new piece of evidence arrived, a set of audio files that had been hidden in a backup drive found in a storage unit. The files were raw and unedited, longer takes, that included the moments before and after the clipped scream. Forensics had been able to recover context that the edited CDs had obscured. Jonah and Mara sat in a small viewing room with the DA and the forensics tech. The room smelled of coffee and the faint metallic tang of equipment. The first file played. Anna's voice, softer, answering questions about her work. She spoke about light and composition and the way a camera could make a corner of a room holy. The man's voice, low, measured, asked about boundaries. Anna answered, "I set boundaries.
I say stop when I need to.
I say no when I need to." The man's voice replied, "We respect boundaries. We preserve what matters." The recording continued. There was laughter, the clink of glasses, the rustle of fabric. Then a longer exchange. Anna said she had a plan to leave, that she had a room booked, that she wanted to be a person and not a thing. The man, someone whose voice matched other recordings but whose identity was not yet confirmed, said, "Leaving is messy. We can make it easier. We can preserve you. We can keep your memories safe." Anna's voice tightened. "I don't want to be preserved.
I want to be alive." There was a pause.
The man's voice softened. "We can help you. We can make sure you're taken care of." The recording went on for several minutes, the voices weaving around each other like a negotiation. Then, toward the end, Anna's voice rose in a way that made Jonah's skin prickle. "No," she said.
No, I said no," the man's voice answered, not with force, but with a tone that carried the weight of consequence.
"You don't understand what being chosen means. It's not just a moment. It's a future. You will be remembered." Anna's reply was a whisper.
"I don't want to be remembered like that." The file ended with the same muffled sound and the scream.
But this time, the context made the scream feel less like an isolated act and more like the culmination of a conversation that had been steered away from the possibility of leaving. The recording suggested a pattern: offers made as favors, favors withheld, gratitude turned into leverage. Elena sat back and let the silence settle. "This is the context we needed," she said. "It shows a dynamic. It shows someone trying to negotiate their exit and someone else reframing exit as loss to the patrons. That's coercion by attrition." Victor's defense team called the recordings a fabrication. They demanded chain of custody proofs and forensic verification. The forensics tech, a woman named Anika, explained the recovery process with the calm of someone who had spent years coaxing truth from corrupted files. She described how the backup drive had been found, how timestamps and metadata corroborated the file's authenticity, and how audio analysis had shown edits in the CDs but continuity in the recovered files. The defense filed motions to suppress the audio, to challenge the warrants, and to question the DA's motives. The legal fight became a second front. The ledger and the tin box and the Polaroids were now evidence in a war of narratives: art versus exploitation, consent versus coercion, privacy versus accountability. Outside the courthouse, the city's reaction hardened. Protesters gathered, some holding signs that read "Justice for Anna," others holding placards that said "Art is consent." The media fed on the spectacle. Opinion pieces argued that the case would define how the city treated private economies of intimacy. The DA's office felt the pressure of public expectation and the weight of legal prudence. Jonah found himself in the middle of two storms, the legal one and the moral one. He had to keep the investigation tight, to protect witnesses, and to ensure that the evidence was admissible. He also had to keep his own sense of right and wrong from being flattened by the machinery of law and PR. Then, in the middle of the legal skirmishes, a woman named Sarah, the model who had testified about pressure, came forward with a new piece of evidence. A ledger entry she had kept in a small notebook, a private accounting of favors and envelopes and the names of patrons who had asked for certain images. She had kept it because she had been ashamed and because she had wanted to remember who had asked for what. The notebook matched the ledger's shorthand and included a penciled cedar leaf beside several names. Sarah's notebook was a small, human thing that made the ledger's cold lines feel like a wound. It showed how favors had been recorded and how gratitude had been turned into a currency. It showed that the ledger was not only a bookkeeping device but a social contract that could be enforced by exclusion. With the recovered audio, the tin box, the Polaroids, the manifest, and Sarah's notebook, the DA felt she had enough to bring charges that would test the legal boundaries of coercion. The charges were not simple. They would allege a pattern of coercive conduct, the use of a trust to facilitate payments designed to create leverage, and the storage and possession of personal artifacts used to maintain control. The legal theory was novel and would be contested, but it was a narrative that connected the ledger's pencil marks to human consequences. Victor's team responded with fury. They painted the DA as an overreaching prosecutor, attacking art and patronage. They leaked selective clips and photographs to sympathetic outlets. They tried to shape the narrative by releasing images of consenting adults and by framing the recovered audio as ambiguous. The public's appetite for certainty made the courtroom a theater where both sides performed. Jonah felt the pressure of the moment like a physical thing. He had to prepare witnesses, to secure protective orders, and to keep the investigation from being derailed by legal theatrics. He also had to keep Mara safe. The watcher in the garden and the scarred man had shown they could intimidate. One night, as Jonah reviewed the recovered files, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You have what you need.
Don't let them turn it into a circus.
Some windows must stay clean." The message was a threat and a plea. Jonah stared at the screen and felt the ledger's lines blur. The money garden had thorns as well as fruit. He put the phone down and looked at the Polaroid in the evidence envelope. Anna's smile in that small square was private and fragile. The recovered audio had given them context and a narrative that could be presented in court. It had also made the case more dangerous. Powerful people do not like being exposed. They like their windows clean. As the DA prepared indictments, Jonah and Mara continued to gather witnesses and corroboration. They knew the legal fight would be brutal and that the public would demand a tidy ending. They knew the legal fight would be brutal and that the public would demand a tidy ending. They also knew that the truth, when it came, would be messy and necessary. The recovered audio had given them a voice they could not ignore. The ledger had given them a map. The tin box had given them a photograph that a woman had left for herself. The network had shown its edges. Now the law would have to decide whether a pattern of favors and leverage could be prosecuted as coercion, and whether a culture of discretion could be held accountable for the human costs it produced. Outside, the city turned and watched. Inside the DA's office, the team prepared to take the case to a grand jury. The ledger's pencil marks, the cedar leaf, the Polaroids, the manifest, the audio, each piece would be a thread in a narrative that sought to make visible what had been kept invisible. The work would be slow and painful and public, and somewhere, in a room that had once been a studio, someone was still cataloguing memories. The ledger's cedar leaf had been stamped on invitations and on envelopes and on the backs of photographs. The collection had been assembled with care. The question now was whether the law could dismantle a market that had been built on discretion and the quiet commodification of intimacy. The audio file that had ended with a scream had become the hinge of the case. It had given Anna a voice in a way that photographs could not. It had shown a negotiation that had been steered away from exit. It had made the ledger's pencil marks feel like more than numbers. The DA would ask a grand jury to indict. The defense would fight. The city would watch. Jonah closed his laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. He thought of Anna's unfinished sentence in the journal, "If I cannot be a room, I will," and felt the ache of it like a physical thing. He thought of the tin box and the Polaroids and the ledger's cedar leaf. He thought of the man with the scar, and the watcher in the garden, and the way the network had learned to make silence a commodity. The case had moved from the edges into the center of a private economy that traded discretion for intimacy. The next steps would be legal and public and dangerous. But for the first time since Anna had disappeared, Jonah felt that the investigation had a shape that could be presented to a jury, not a tidy story, but a mosaic of fragments that, when placed together, might show a picture that no one wanted to see. The grand jury convened in a windowless room that smelled of coffee and old paper, the kind of place where decisions are made in the language of procedure. Elena Park sat at the head of the table with a stack of exhibits, the ledger photocopies, the tin box photograph, the recovered audio files, Sarah's notebook, the warehouse manifest. Each item had been catalogued, labelled and cross-referenced until the evidence formed a lattice that could be presented in court. The DA's case was not a single accusation, but a pattern, a private economy of favours and leverage that had produced harm. Jonah watched the jurors file in, ordinary faces,
Ordinary clothes, the civic weight of people asked to translate fragments into a verdict.
He felt the case like a pressure in his chest. The ledger's pencil marks had become a public thing. The cedar leaf watermark had been shown on a projector. The audio had been played in a room where silence had become a verdict. The legal machinery moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a machine that had been designed to protect rights and to prevent abuse. Outside the courthouse, the city had divided into camps. Protesters gathered on the plaza, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Anna," others holding placards that said, "Art is consent." The media circled like gulls. The DA's office had prepared for the spectacle, but spectacle has a way of changing the shape of truth. Jonah felt the pressure of public expectation like a physical thing. He had to keep the investigation tight and the witnesses safe. Then Lila disappeared. It was a small, sharp shock. She had been scheduled to testify in a closed session the following week. She had been quiet since her first confession, but she had agreed to come forward again, to answer questions about Anna's plans and the messages she had kept. The morning she was due to meet the DA, her phone went straight to voicemail. Her apartment door was locked from the outside. Her car was gone. Her friends said she had left a note, "I can't do this," but no one had seen her leave. Jonah felt the world tilt. Disappearances have a way of making the past feel immediate. He thought of Anna's unfinished sentence and of the tin box and of the ledger's cedar leaf. He thought of the watcher in the garden and the scar that had made the ledger's initials feel like a threat. He thought of the anonymous texts that had told him to stop. They launched a search. Officers canvassed Lila's neighborhood, checked surveillance footage, and interviewed the people she had been with the night before. A taxi driver remembered dropping her near a river walk. A convenience store clerk remembered her buying a bottle of water. The trail was thin and human. It suggested a woman who had left in a hurry or a woman who had been taken. 2 days later, Lila returned. She walked into the DA's office like someone who had been carrying a weight too long. Her hair was uncombed, her eyes rimmed with red. She sat down and folded her hands. The room felt like a place where confessions are both weapon and balm. "I left because I was scared," she said.
I thought if I disappeared, they would stop.
"I thought if I made myself invisible, they would forget to use me as an example."
I was wrong. Jonah listened and felt the old, familiar ache.
Lila's fear was not a private thing. It was a symptom of the network's power. The people who profit from discretion do not like witnesses. They prefer silence. Lila had tried to buy silence with her absence and had found that absence only sharpened the appetite for narrative. She told them what had happened in the days before she vanished. A man had come to her flower shop and asked questions about Anna's schedule. He had been polite and insistent. He had left a card with a cedar leaf embossed on it. Lila had kept the card because she thought it was a business card. Later that night, someone had left a Polaroid under her door, the same kind Jonah had found in Mara's envelope, showing Anna smiling at a table with the scarred man half in shadow. The back of the Polaroid had the line, "She chose to stay." Lila had panicked. She had taken a bus out of town and stayed in a motel for 2 nights. She had watched the news and read the comments and felt the city's appetite for certainty like a physical thing. She had come back because she could not run forever. She had come back because she wanted to tell the truth. Her testimony was messy and human. She admitted to lying at first to protect Anna's plan. She admitted to being ashamed of the ways she had tried to manage danger. She admitted that the ledger's initials had meant nothing to her until the Polaroid had arrived. Her honesty made the DA's case both stronger and more fragile. Stronger because it showed the human cost of secrecy. Fragile because it revealed how easily fear could shape testimony. While Lila's return steadied one part of the investigation, another thread frayed. A woman who had been a peripheral figure in Victor's circle, someone who had once been photographed at a salon and who had later left the scene, came forward with a confession in exchange for immunity. She named a patron, a developer with a taste for private salons and a reputation for making introductions. She named a logistics coordinator who had signed manifests and stored boxes. She named a man with a scar who had been seen in the garden. Her testimony widened the net. It suggested that the trust's donors were not only patrons but active participants in a culture that monetized discretion. It suggested that the ledger's penciled cedar leaf was not merely a brand but a signature of belonging. The DA's team began to see the network as a social architecture, invitations, events, photographs, envelopes, storage, and a culture of plausible deniability. Jonah felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. He had to balance the legal need for corroboration with the human need for protection. Witnesses were frightened. Some recanted under pressure.
Others stood firm.
The public's appetite for a tidy narrative made the work harder. The messy truth resisted headlines. In the middle of the grand jury proceedings, a new ledger entry surfaced, one that had been overlooked in the initial sweep. It was a small penciled note in a margin, a name Jonah did not expect, written in the same neat hand as the rest of the ledger. The name belonged to someone close to Lila, a man who had been a donor to a community arts program and who had once given Lila a grant for her floral installations. The penciled cedar leaf sat beside his name. Jonah felt the room tilt. The ledger's lines had become a map that reached into neighborhoods and friendships. The network's edges were not only in marble foyers and shuttered lofts. They were in community centers and grant committees. The cedar leaf had stamped itself on places that wanted to be seen as generous. He brought the new entry to Elena. She read it with a slow, careful attention. "This is the kind of connective tissue we need," she said. "It shows how the trust's reach extends into civic life. It complicates the narrative of patrons as benign benefactors. They subpoenaed the donor's records. The man's name, public, respectable, appeared in receipts and donation lists. He had been a donor to the trust and had attended salons. He had also been photographed at a gallery opening with Lila. The connection was small and human and ugly in its implication. A man who had once supported community art had also been part of a network that commodified intimacy. The legal team moved carefully. They did not want to ruin reputations without cause, but they also could not ignore the ledger's lines. The grand jury listened to testimony, reviewed exhibits, and asked questions that cut through the rhetoric. The ledger's penciled cedar leaf had become a symbol in the room, a mark that signaled membership in a private economy. As the grand jury deliberated, Jonah and Mara followed a new lead, a remote property outside the city where a private event had been held the night Anna disappeared. The property was a converted farmhouse with a long drive and a gate that closed like a mouth. It had been rented under a shell company name and had hosted a small gathering billed as an intimate salon. The maintenance logs showed a delivery that matched the catering receipt. The ledger's circled date matched the event. They prepared a raid with warrants in hand. The team moved at dawn, the farmhouse's silhouette a dark thing against the pale sky. Officers fanned out, cameras rolling, evidence techs ready. The property felt like a stage set left mid-scene, chairs arranged in a semicircle, a table with half-drunk glasses, a backdrop folded against a wall. It had the hush of a place where people had been made to perform. In a back room, they found a staged scene, a chair with a scarf draped over it, a Polaroid on the seat with Anna's face blurred, and a small tin box with a photograph tucked inside. The photograph was not Anna's. It was a different woman, smiling in a way that suggested a different story. The Polaroid on the chair had been deliberately blurred, an attempt to create ambiguity, to manufacture doubt. Jonah felt the bile rise. The staged scene was a provocation, a deliberate attempt to confuse the narrative, to plant evidence that would make the public and the jurors doubt the recovered audio and the tin box photograph. Someone had tried to create a counter-story, a false artifact to muddy the waters. They bagged the items and catalogued the room. Forensics found traces of adhesive and a printer spool that matched the Polaroid's emulsion. The staged scene had been manufactured recently. The question was who had made it and why. Back at the DA's office, the grand jury returned an indictment on several counts: conspiracy to coerce, use of a trust to facilitate payments designed to create leverage, and possession of personal artifacts used to maintain control. The indictment named a small group of defendants, Victor Hale, Marcus Vale, and a few donors whose names had appeared in the ledger. The charges were not the end. They were the beginning of a legal fight that would test the boundaries of coercion law. The public reaction was immediate and polarized. Supporters of the defendants called the indictments an attack on art and patronage. Advocates for survivors called them a long overdue reckoning. The city's newspapers ran editorials that argued both sides with the fervor of people who wanted certainty. The ledger's cedar leaf had become a symbol in the public square, a mark of belonging and a mark of shame. Jonah felt the moral complexity like a bruise. The indictment was a legal milestone, but it did not guarantee justice. Powerful people have resources and lawyers who can make time an ally. The defense would challenge the audio, the chain of custody, and the interpretation of the ledger. They would argue consent and artistic freedom. The DA's team would have to show how a pattern of favors and leverage could amount to coercion. In the days after the indictment, threats increased. Anonymous messages arrived at the DA's office and at Jonah's home. A package left at Mara's door contained a single Polaroid. Anna's face blurred, the back stamped with a cedar leaf. The message was clear. The network could manufacture doubt and fear. Mara taped the Polaroid to her corkboard and stared at it until the edges blurred. She thought of Anna's drafts and the rental agreement and the unfinished sentence. She thought of the ledger and the tin box and the way the network had learned to make silence a commodity. She thought of the staged scene at the farmhouse and the way someone had tried to rewrite the story. Jonah sat at his desk and read the indictment again. The names were on the page like a map. The ledger's cedar leaf had been translated into legal language. The grand jury had done its work. The DA had done hers. Now the courtroom would decide whether a pattern of favors and leverage could be prosecuted as coercion. He felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. He thought of Anna's unfinished sentence. If I cannot be a room, I will. And felt the ache of it like a physical thing. He thought of Lila's fear and return, and the way the ledger's lines had reached into neighborhoods and friendships. He thought of the staged scene and the Polaroid left on Mara's doorstep. Somewhere in the city, someone was deciding whether to speak. Somewhere, a ledger was being updated. Somewhere, a hand had reached for a camera and then stopped. The indictment had given them a legal foothold, but the work of truth, messy, human, and slow, was only beginning. The city has a way of rearranging itself around scandal. News crawls, late-night pundits, the slow churn of opinion pieces that turn private grief into public spectacle. For Jonah, the rearrangement arrived as a personal avalanche. An old case file, one he had thought closed, one that had left a scar he kept to himself, was pulled into the light by a defense team eager to discredit him. A reporter with a taste for drama found a transcript from a hearing years ago and framed it as evidence of Jonah's bias. The headline read like a verdict: "Detectives past raises questions in high-profile case." Jonah read the piece in the squad room, the fluorescent lights making the words look sharper than they felt. He felt the old bruise open. The defense lawyers were surgical. They knew how to weaponize history. They leaked selective excerpts, suggested procedural errors, and implied that Jonah's judgment could not be trusted. The DA's office braced for the predictable fallout: calls for recusal, whispers in the courthouse corridors, a slow erosion of public confidence. It was the kind of pressure that makes small mistakes inevitable. Jonah found himself snapping at colleagues, missing a detail in a witness statement, forgetting to follow up on a lead. He slept badly and woke with the taste of metal in his mouth. He had always believed that the work required a kind of moral clarity. Now he felt that clarity being chipped away by the very system he served. At home, the strange showed in the small things. He missed a dinner with his sister. He forgot to pick up his son from soccer practice. His partner, Mara, noticed the way he flinched at his phone and the way his jaw tightened when he read emails. She tried to steady him with practical things: lists, schedules, reminders, but the legal assault had a way of making the world feel unstable. "You can't let them make this about you," Mara said one night as they sat in the car outside the DA's office. "The city lights a smear in the windshield. We have evidence. We have witnesses."
"Don't let them distract you," Jonah wanted to believe her.
He wanted to be the steady hand he had been in other cases. But the defense's strategy was working. Make the investigator the story, and the evidence becomes background noise. He felt the case slipping into a theater where performance mattered as much as truth. While Jonah fought the erosion of his credibility, Mara found a different kind of pressure: the moral weight of telling Anna's story without turning it into spectacle. She had been cataloguing Anna's drafts for weeks, moving through sentences that read like a woman trying to map herself out of a life that had been curated for others. The drafts were luminous and jagged, aphorisms that became confessions, lists that became manifestos. One night, alone in the archive, Mara found a hidden folder on Anna's laptop that she had missed before. It was buried under a directory labeled Projects and encrypted with a password that Anna had written in a margin of a notebook. Remember the room. Mara worked through the encryption with the patience of someone who had coaxed secrets from brittle paper. The folder opened to a file titled Manifesto for Myself. The manifesto was not a manifesto in the political sense. It was a ledger of self-claims.
Anna wrote about light and the way cameras make corners holy.
She wrote about the economy of being chosen and the slow accrual of favors that become obligations. She wrote about rooms and windows and the difference between being looked at and being seen. The language was spare and fierce. There was a passage that made Mara sit back and breathe as if she had been struck. I will not be curated into someone else's memory. If they will not let me leave, I will make a map of my leaving. I will name the people who offered me futures and the prices they asked. I will keep a tin box of proof. If I cannot be a room, I will be a ledger that remembers. The manifesto read like a plan and a warning. It suggested that Anna had been thinking in terms of contingency, of exits, and of records that could survive her absence.
Mara felt the urgency of it like a pulse.
The manifesto was a moral document as much as an evidentiary one, a woman asserting her personhood in language that could be used in court or burned in private. Mara printed the manifesto and brought it to the DA. Elena read it with a slow, careful attention.
"This is powerful," she said.
It shows intent and fear and a plan. It's not proof of a crime, but it's context. It shows that Anna was thinking about leaving and about how to make that leaving legible. The manifesto changed the team's approach. They began to look for the artifacts Anna had mentioned: the tin box, the ledger of favors, the rental agreement for the coastal apartment. They re-interviewed witnesses with the manifesto in hand, asking whether anyone had seen Anna preparing to leave, whether anyone had noticed a tin box or a photograph she kept close. The new focus produced a lead, a remote property outside the city, a converted farmhouse with a long drive and a gate that closed like a mouth. The property had been rented under a shell company name for a private salon the night Anna disappeared. Maintenance logs, catering receipts, and a ledger entry with a circled date matched the event. The farmhouse had been mentioned in a whispered conversation on the encrypted forum Mara had been unable to crack. Someone had referred to it as the quiet place. They prepared a raid with warrants in hand. The team moved at dawn, the farmhouse's silhouette a dark thing against a pale sky.
Officers fanned out, cameras rolling, evidence techs ready.
The property felt like a stage set left mid-scene, chairs arranged in a semicircle, a table with half-drunk glasses, a backdrop folded against a wall. It had the hush of a place where people had been made to perform. In a back room, they found a staged scene, a chair with a scarf draped over it, a Polaroid on the seat with Anna's face blurred, and a small tin box with a photograph tucked inside. The photograph was not Anna's. It was a different woman, smiling in a way that suggested a different story. The Polaroid on the chair had been deliberately blurred, an attempt to create ambiguity, to manufacture doubt. Jonah felt the bile rise. The staged scene was a provocation, a deliberate attempt to confuse the narrative, to plant evidence that would make the public and the jurors doubt the recovered audio and the tin box photograph. Someone had tried to create a counter-story, a false artifact to muddy the waters. They bagged the items and catalogued the room. Forensics found traces of adhesive and a printer spool that matched the Polaroid's emulsion. The staged scene had been manufactured recently. The question was who had made it and why. But the farmhouse yielded more than a staged tableau. In a locked closet behind a false panel, an evidence tech found a small wooden crate. Inside were envelopes, some empty, some with cash, and a stack of Polaroids. The Polaroids were arranged like a private museum: faces, hands, a shoulder, a profile, each with a note on the back. Some notes were mundane.
Others were possessive.
One Polaroid slid to the top of the stack, made Jonah's hands go cold. It showed Anna seated at a table, her head turned slightly, eyes not quite meeting the camera. Beside her, half in shadow, was a man Jonah recognized from the ledger and from a photograph that had once been tucked into Lila's community grant file, a man who had been a donor to local arts programs, someone who had once given Lila a small grant for a floral installation. The man's face was ordinary in a way that made the image worse, respectable, civic, the kind of person who smiles at ribbon cuttings and sits on boards. On the back of the Polaroid, in the same neat hand as the ledger, were 3 words, "For the harvest, always." Jonah stared at the words until they blurred. The phrase was the same one he had seen in another case file months earlier, a phrase that had been scrawled on a photograph found in a tin box in a different investigation. The cedar leaf, the ledger, the tin box. Threads were knotting together in a way that made the city's civic life look like a stage for private economies. He thought of Lila's earlier confession about a name that had appeared in the ledger, of the penciled cedar leaf beside a donor's name, of the way the Trust's reach had extended into community centres and grant committees. The Polaroid on the farmhouse table suggested that the network's edges were not only in marble foyers and shuttered lofts, they were in the places where people did good and expected nothing in return. Jonah felt the case tilt. The man in the Polaroid was not a shadowy patron in a distant gallery. He was someone who had been part of Lila's world. The implication was a small, private violence. The ledger's cedar leaf had stamped itself on neighborhoods and friendships. They bagged the Polaroid and the crate and the envelopes. Forensics would test the paper, the ink, the fingerprints. The DA's office would have to decide whether to add new names to the indictment. The legal team moved with the slow, deliberate caution of people who knew how quickly reputations could be ruined and how easily the defense could turn the narrative into a smear campaign. That night, Jonah drove to Lila's shop. The floral shop was a small, bright place that smelled of citrus and soil, a place that had once felt like refuge. Lila was there, arranging a bouquet with hands that trembled. When Jonah showed her the Polaroid, she did not look surprised. She had the look of someone who had been carrying a secret too long. "That's him," she said quietly. "He gave me a grant."
He came to the opening. He liked my work.
He was kind, he was
Civic. Did Anna ever mention him?
Jonah asked. Lila's eyes filled. She said he was generous. She said he had a way of making people feel honored. She said she trusted him.
I thought she was safe because he was respectable. I was wrong. Jonah felt the old familiar ache.
The ledger's lines had reached into the places people trusted. The network had learned to hide in plain sight. The Polaroid was a small, human thing that made the ledger's cold lines feel like a wound. Back at the station, the forensics tech called with a preliminary result. The Polaroid's emulsion matched the same printer spool found at the farmhouse. The handwriting on the back matched the ledger's neat hand. The envelope had traces of a cologne that matched samples taken from Victor's estate. The connections were not proof of a single crime, but they were a lattice of implication. Then, as if the case had not already become complicated enough, someone leaked a photograph to a tabloid, a cropped image of Jonah at a protest years ago, his face in profile, a headline that suggested bias. The leak was strategic. It was meant to make the public doubt the investigator and to make witnesses hesitate. Jonah felt the world tilt again. The defense had learned how to fight in the court of public opinion. Mara, meanwhile, had been working through Anna's drafts and the manifesto and had found a folder of unsent messages, notes Anna had written to herself and to people she had once trusted. One message was addressed to Elle, a short, fierce paragraph that read like a plea and a warning. "If you ever find this, know I tried."
I tried to leave. I tried to be a room. If I fail, remember the ledger? Remember the cedar leaf?
Remember who smiled at ribbon cuttings and who kept tin boxes in closets. Mara printed the message and took it to Lila. The two women sat in the floral shop, the scent of cut stems around them, and read Anna's words like a small private testament. Lila wept quietly and then steadied herself. "I should have known," she said. "I should have seen the ledger's reach. I thought generosity was a shield." Mara put a hand on Lila's shoulder.
"He tried to protect her," she said.
"You lied because you loved her. That doesn't make you complicit in what happened." Lila looked at Jonah then, and for the first time there was a hard clarity in her face.
"I want to testify," she said.
"I want to tell the truth about the ledger and the people who signed it. I want to name names." Jonah felt a small, private relief. Lila's willingness to speak would be a blow to the defense's strategy of doubt, but he also knew the cost. Naming names would make Lila a target. The network had already shown it could manufacture doubt and fear. It could also manufacture threats. The next morning, as the DA prepared to expand the indictment to include new names suggested by the farmhouse evidence, Jonah received a call from Priya. She had traced a series of small transfers that linked the donor in the Polaroid to the trust's mailbox. The transfers were oblique, donations to community programs, payments to vendors, but the pattern suggested a funnel. The donor's name appeared in receipts and in the ledger's margins. Priya's voice was steady but urgent. "We can tie him to the trust," she said. "We can show he attended salons. We can show he paid vendors. The paper trail is messy, but it's there." Jonah felt the case like a living thing that would not be quieted. The ledger's cedar leaf had stamped itself on neighborhoods and friendships. The network's edges had reached into civic life. The indictment would be expanded, and the defense would respond with fury. That afternoon, Jonah sat in the DA's office and watched as Elena signed the new subpoenas. The legal machinery moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a machine that had been designed to protect rights and to prevent abuse. The expanded indictment would name new defendants and widen the net. The public would react. The defense would fight. As the team prepared for the next round, Mara received an anonymous message. "You found the manifesto. Good. Don't make it a spectacle. Some rooms are private for a reason." The message was a warning and a plea. Mara felt the air go thin. She taped Anna's manifesto to her corkboard and stared at it until the edges blurred. The words, "I will not be curated into someone else's memory," felt like a command. She thought of the tin box and the Polaroids and the ledger's cedar leaf. She thought of the man in the Polaroid who had once given Lila a grant. She thought of the way the network had learned to hide in plain sight. The case had moved from the edges into the center of civic life. The legal fight would be brutal and public. The defense would try to make the investigator the story and to make the evidence ambiguous. The DA would have to show how a pattern of favors and leverage could amount to coercion. Witnesses would have to be protected. Lives would be rearranged. Jonah left the DA's office that evening and drove past the glass garden. The trellises were dark, the lemon tree a silhouette against the sky. He thought of Anna's unfinished sentence, "If I cannot be a room, I will," and felt the ache of it like a physical thing. He thought of the tin box and the Polaroids and the ledger's cedar leaf. He thought of the man who had smiled at ribbon cuttings and the way generosity can be a mask. He parked and sat for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The city's lights blinked. The case had become a tangle of legal strategy, moral reckoning, and human cost. He felt the weight of it like a hand on his chest. Somewhere, someone was deciding whether to speak. Somewhere, a ledger was being updated. Somewhere, a hand had reached for a camera and then stopped. Jonah tightened his grip on the steering wheel and drove toward the next thread, knowing that each answer would bring new questions and that the truth, when it came, would be complicated and necessary. They called it the quiet place because, from the road, it looked like nothing at all. A narrow lane, a gate that sagged a little on its hinges, a gravel drive that led to a house with peeling paint, and a porch that leaned. The property had been rented under a shell company name the night Anna disappeared. The maintenance logs and the ledger's circled date had put it on their map. Now, with subpoenas served and indictments filed, Jonah had a warrant and a team that moved like a single organism. Officers, evidence techs, a DA representative, and Mara, who insisted on being there when the house was entered. They moved at dawn. The sky was the colour of thin paper, and the air had the brittle clarity of a morning that had not yet been warmed by gossip. Officers fanned out, cameras rolling, flashlights cutting through the dust motes. The house smelled of old wood and lemon oil and the faint chemical tang of studio lights. Chairs were stacked in a corner. A backdrop leaned against a wall. It was a place that had been arranged to look like a set and then abandoned. Jonah went room to room, cataloguing, photographing, bagging. The farmhouse yielded the usual things: envelopes, Polaroids, a ledger page tucked into a Bible. In a back room, behind a false panel, an evidence tech found a narrow door that opened onto a cellar. The cellar was low and cool. The light from their headlamps pooled on crates and boxes. In the far corner, beneath a tarp, something moved. "Police!" Jonah called, and the voice that answered was small and raw. "Please, help." They pulled the tarp away and found Anna curled on a pallet, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lemon and lavender. Her hair was shorter than in the photographs, her face thinner, but when she looked up and saw Jonah, something like recognition, relief, suspicion, exhaustion passed over her features. She blinked, as if the light itself were a question. Jonah crouched and put his hand on the pallet, as if to steady himself.
"Anna," he said, the name a small, careful thing.
"You're safe now."
"We're here." She swallowed and tried to sit.
Her hands trembled. Mara was at her side in an instant, kneeling, offering a thermos of tea and a voice that was steady and soft. "It's okay," Mara said. "You're okay." Anna's eyes moved from face to face, Jonah, Mara, the DA's representative, and then to the doorway where officers stood like sentries. She looked like someone who had been taught to measure the room before she trusted it.
"They said they would preserve me," she said, her voice thin.
"They said they would keep me for the harvest." The phrase landed in the cellar like a stone. Jonah felt the ledger's cedar leaf press against his ribs. He had seen the phrase before, on Polaroids, in tin boxes, scrawled in margins. It had been a private motto, a way of making possession sound like devotion. Hearing it spoken by the woman who had been its subject made it obscene. They brought her upstairs slowly, wrapped in a blanket, and escorted by officers who had been briefed to be gentle. The house's rooms looked different in daylight. The staged chairs, the backdrop, the table with half-drunk glasses. The evidence techs photographed everything, careful not to disturb the small human things that might be evidence of a life interrupted. In the kitchen, Anna sat at a table and drank tea with hands that shook. She answered questions in short bursts, the way someone who had been rehearsing answers for months might answer: where she had been, who had been there, what had happened. Her story was not a single, cinematic moment, but a series of negotiations and attritions. She told them about the invitations, how they had arrived with a cedar leaf watermark and a tone that made being chosen feel like an honor. She told them about the first time she had gone to a salon, the flattering attention, the money, the introductions. She told them about the ledger and the envelopes and the way favors accumulated into obligations. She told them about the studio sessions that had been framed as art, and about the recordings that had been edited to make certain moments disappear. "I thought I could leave," she said, and the sentence broke.
"I had a room. I had a plan. I told Lila, I told myself I would go."
But they made leaving sound like loss. They told me I would be remembered if I stayed. They told me I would be forgotten if I left. She described the night she had been brought to the farmhouse as a negotiation that had been steered away from exit. "They said they would help me," she said. "They said they would make sure I was taken care of. They said I would be preserved.
I thought maybe if I stayed, I could buy a future.
But the future they offered was not mine. It was a memory they would keep. Her testimony was not a tidy accusation of a single violent act. It was a ledger of small violences, the pressure of favors, the withholding of introductions, the slow erosion of autonomy. She spoke of envelopes left under pillows, of promises that came with strings, of the way gratitude can become a leash. Jonah listened and felt the case settle into a new shape. The law had been searching for a smoking gun. Anna's account offered something different, a pattern. It showed how a private economy could manufacture consent by making the alternative, exclusion, seem like a ruin. It showed how people who had power could turn generosity into leverage. The DA's team recorded her statement and arranged for medical and psychological care. They gave her time and space to rest. They also began to prepare for the legal work that would follow: witness protection, subpoenas, and the careful choreography of testimony that would have to translate Anna's lived experience into legal language. But the rescue did not end the danger. The network had shown it could manufacture doubt and fear. It could also retaliate. Within hours of Anna's discovery, the defense team launched a counter-offensive. They leaked selective clips to sympathetic outlets, clips that cropped Anna's voice, that emphasized moments where she smiled, that framed her as a willing participant. They painted the DA's case as an attack on art and patronage. They suggested that Anna had been a willing adult who had chosen to stay. Jonah watched the media storm with a kind of weary fury. The defense's strategy was to make the public see what they wanted to see: a curated smile, a cropped clip, a narrative that fit neatly into a headline. The Ledger's cedar leaf had become a brand. The brand had become a shield. The legal fight that followed was brutal and public. The DA's office moved to secure Anna's testimony and to protect other witnesses. They filed motions to prevent the defense from releasing selective clips and to preserve the chain of custody for the recovered audio. The defense argued for artistic freedom and for the right of adults to make choices. The courtroom became a theater where both sides performed their versions of truth. In the weeks that followed, Anna's presence in the case reframed everything. Her testimony gave context to the ledger and the tin box and the Polaroids. It made the recovered audio feel less like an isolated artifact and more like a record of a system. It made the DA's theory, coercion by attrition, legible, but it also complicated the public's appetite for certainty. Some people saw Anna's rescue as vindication. The network had been exposed and justice would follow. Others saw it as proof that the DA had overreached, that adults had made choices, and that the law should not police intimacy. The city's conversations were noisy and polarized. Inside the DA's office, Eleanor prepared for the grand jury testimony that would follow. She knew the legal theory would be novel and contested. She knew the defense would attack the chain of custody, the editing of recordings, and the interpretation of the ledger. She also knew that Anna's voice, raw, exhausted, precise, was the kind of evidence that could move a jury. Jonah and Mara continued to follow threads. Priya traced more transfers and found a pattern of small payments that had been routed through the trust to vendors and coordinators. Forensics found fingerprints on envelopes and Polaroids that matched several defendants. Sarah's notebook and Elise's testimony corroborated the ledger's pattern. The network's edges were being tightened. Then, in a move that showed how wide the ledger's reach had been, a civic board member, someone who had once sat on the same committee as the donor in the Polaroid, resigned amid allegations that his donations had been used to funnel money into the trust. The resignation was a small, public rupture. The ledger's cedar leaf had stamped itself on civic life, and the stain could not be ignored. The indictments that followed named a small group of defendants: Victor Hale, Marcus Vale, and several donors whose names had appeared in the ledger. The charges were not simple. They alleged a pattern of coercive conduct, the use of a trust to facilitate payments designed to create leverage, and the possession and storage of personal artifacts used to maintain control. The legal theory was novel and would be tested in court. As the trial approached, Anna made a choice that reframed the moral center of the case. She agreed to testify publicly, not because she wanted to be a spectacle, but because she wanted to name the ledger's human cost. She sat in the witness chair and spoke in a voice that was steady and precise. She described the invitations, the cedar leaf watermark, the ledger's penciled initials, the envelopes, the tin box, and the way favors had become obligations. Her testimony did not fit the neat categories the public wanted. It was not a tale of abduction or a story of pure consent. It was a ledger of attrition, offers made as favors, favors withheld as punishment, gratitude turned into leverage. She spoke about the shame of being chosen and the shame of being grateful for the very thing that had made her feel small. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet in a way that felt like a verdict. The jurors had heard a human voice that could not be reduced to a headline. The defense tried to pick apart her testimony, selective clips, questions about agency, arguments about artistic freedom, but the pattern she described had been corroborated by documents, manifests, and other witnesses outside the courthouse. The city argued in the language of absolutes. People wanted monsters or saints. They wanted a story that fit neatly into a headline. Jonah found himself resisting that hunger for certainty. He had seen the ledger, the Polaroids, the tin box, and the recordings. He had also seen the small human gestures that complicated the narrative. Anna's careful notes, Lila's shame, Sarah's private notebook, Elise's confession. The trial did not end with a tidy moral. It produced convictions and acquittals, guilty pleas, and hung juries. Some defendants were found guilty of conspiracy and coercion. Others were acquitted on technical grounds. The legal outcomes were messy and partial, justice rendered in degrees rather than absolutes. But the case's larger effect was not only legal. It forced the city to reckon with the ledger's moral economy. Community groups demanded transparency from trusts and foundations. Galleries and salons adopted clearer consent protocols. The DA's office worked with non-profits to create safe exit channels for people who wanted to leave private economies of intimacy without being punished for their choices. Anna's recovery was slow and private. She chose to speak publicly in measured ways and to write in private in ways that were fierce and tender. She published a short essay, part manifesto, part testimony, about rooms and windows and the difference between being looked at and being seen. The essay circulated in the city like a small, stubborn light. Jonah watched the aftermath with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The ledger's cedar leaf had been exposed. The tin boxes had been catalogued. The Polaroids had been shown for what they were. The network had been disrupted but not entirely dismantled. Power has a way of reconstituting itself in new forms. On a late afternoon, months after the raid, Jonah drove to the glass garden. The trellises were green, the lemon tree heavy with fruit. Volunteers picked apples for a community pantry. Children ran between the plots, their laughter bright and ordinary. Anna sat on the bench where the tin box had once been found, her hands in the soil, planting a small seedling. She looked up when Jonah approached and smiled in a way that reached her eyes. They did not speak of verdicts or indictments. They spoke of small things, the taste of lemon, the way light falls through leaves, the stubbornness of roots. Anna handed Jonah a small folded note. On it, in a hand that had once written for the harvest, always, were 3 words: remember and do better. Jonah folded the note and put it in his pocket. He thought of the ledger and the cedar leaf and the way the city had been forced to look at itself. He thought of the work that remained, policy changes, community support, the slow rebuilding of trust. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing," and felt the urgency of it like a pulse. The garden's heart had been found, and in finding it, they had unearthed a truth that refused to be simple. The network had been exposed, its edges frayed by law and testimony. Some people had been held accountable. Others had slipped away into new forms of discretion. The ledger remained in the archive, a record of what had happened and a warning of what can happen when intimacy is commodified. As Jonah walked away from the garden, the city's lights softened into evening. He felt the case like a living thing that had changed him. He had learned that justice is not only about conviction, but about repair, about creating rooms where people can live without being curated, about building systems that make desperate choices less likely, about listening to voices that refuse to be reduced to headlines. Somewhere, a ledger was being updated. Somewhere, a cedar leaf was being stamped on an invitation. But the garden's heart had been found, and the people who had been catalogued had begun, in small ways, to reclaim their rooms. The trial moved like weather, sudden storms,
Long stretches of grey, moments of brittle sunlight that revealed everything at once.
Courtroom days were dense with procedure, objections, motions, expert testimony about audio forensics and chain of custody, careful cross-examinations that tried to turn nuance into doubt. The DA's team presented the ledger as a social architecture. The defense painted salons as consensual gatherings, and the ledger's shorthand as nothing more than bookkeeping. The public watched in fragments, headlines, clips, hot takes. Anna's testimony remained the hinge. She sat in the witness chair with a quiet steadiness that surprised people who had expected spectacle. She described the invitations, the cedar leaf watermark, the ledger's penciled initials, the envelopes left under pillows, the tin box she had kept as a talisman. She spoke about the slow accrual of favors and the way gratitude can become a leash. She spoke about the night at the farmhouse not as a single violent act, but as a negotiation that had been steered away from exit. The jurors listened. They heard the recovered audio in full, the longer takes that had given context to the clipped scream. They heard Sarah's notebook read aloud, the ledger's pages projected on a screen, the manifest that tied crates to storage units. They heard Elise's confession and Lila's testimony about the note she had lied about to protect Anna's plan. They heard Marcus's evasive answers and Victor's lawyer argue for artistic freedom. Verdicts arrived in degrees. Some defendants were convicted on counts that fit the DA's theory: conspiracy to coerce, use of a trust to facilitate payments designed to create leverage, unlawful possession of personal artifacts used to maintain control. Others were acquitted on technical grounds where the defense had successfully raised reasonable doubt about intent or chain of custody. The legal outcomes were messy and partial. They did not map neatly onto the moral map the city had drawn for itself. The aftermath was not only legal. The ledger's exposure forced institutions to look inward. Foundations and trusts adopted clearer transparency rules. Galleries and salons instituted consent protocols and independent advocates for participants. A coalition of non-profits formed a rapid response fund for people who wanted to leave private economies of intimacy without losing housing or health care. The DA's office worked with social services to create safe exit channels and emergency grants, small, practical measures that aimed to reduce the pressure that had made the ledger's market possible. Anna's recovery was slow and private. She declined many interview requests and refused to be turned into a symbol. When she did speak, it was in measured essays and in a short, fiercely personal piece she published in a local journal, a meditation on rooms and windows, on the difference between being looked at and being seen. She wrote about the ledger as a social contract that had been weaponized, and about the small rituals she had used to remember herself. The tin box, the photograph, the list of names she kept in a notebook she called a map. The city's conversation shifted.
Not entirely, but enough.
People began to talk about the ethics of patronage and the responsibilities of institutions that brokered intimacy. Some donors resigned from boards. Some patrons retreated from the salons they had once frequented.
Others doubled down, insisting that art must be free of legal policing.
The debate was noisy and unresolved, but it had moved from gossip to policy. Jonah felt the cost of the case in the small, private ways it had rearranged his life. The defense's attempt to weaponize his past had left a bruise that did not fully heal. He had to answer questions about judgment and bias. He had to sit through hearings where his motives were past. He lost a promotion he had expected and gained a reputation that was complicated and public. He learned to live with the knowledge that doing the right thing in a messy world often meant paying a personal price. Mara's work shifted from investigation to stewardship. She curated the archive of names and artifacts with a care that felt like penance and repair. The repository they had proposed, anonymized, secure, and community-run, became a pilot program. People deposited ledgers, receipts, and testimonies. Social workers and historians used the anonymized data to design interventions. Mara wrote an essay about the ethics of archiving trauma, how to preserve memory without exploiting it, how to make records useful for prevention rather than spectacle. Lila became an advocate. She testified, she organized, and she worked with community groups to create safe channels for people who needed to leave private economies of intimacy. Her floral shop became a small hub for mutual aid, a place where people could pick up a bag of food, a bus ticket, or a referral to a counselor. She had once tried to protect Anna by keeping a secret. Now she tried to protect others by making help visible. The men who had been convicted served sentences that varied in length. Some cooperated with investigators and provided names in exchange for reduced charges. Others appealed and fought the verdicts in higher courts. The trust that had funneled money into private events dissolved under legal pressure and public scrutiny. New entities rose in its place, some more transparent, some merely rebranded. The ledger's cedar leaf did not disappear. It migrated, as symbols do, into new contexts. Months after the trial, Jonah received a letter from Anna. It was short and handwritten, the kind of note that felt like a small, private thing in a world of press releases. "Thank you for finding me," she wrote.
Not for the headlines, but for the way you listened.
"Keep looking for the rooms." He kept the letter in his wallet like a talisman. The city's policy changes were modest but meaningful. Emergency grants for people in precarious creative economies, clearer consent protocols at galleries, and a county task force on patronage and power. The repository's anonymized data informed a report that recommended funding for rural and urban safety nets, because the ledger had not been only about art. It had been about scarcity and the ways people trade dignity for survival. In the quiet after the trial, Jonah returned to the glass garden. The lemon tree had grown. Volunteers tended plots and taught children how to graft branches and save seeds. Anna visited sometimes, quietly, planting seedlings and sitting on the bench with a thermos of tea. She did not seek the camera's light. She preferred the small, ordinary work of tending. One afternoon, Jonah found her at the bench, a small tin box in her lap. She handed it to him without ceremony. Inside was the faded Polaroid he had first seen in the tin box at the garden, the photograph of her on the bench, the note on the back, "For when I forget who I am." She had written a new line on the back, "Remember and do better." Jonah folded the photograph and put it in his pocket. He thought of the ledger and the cedar leaf and the way the city had been forced to look at itself. He thought of the small policy changes and the repository and the people who had been willing to tell the truth. He thought of the work that remained, the slow building of systems that make desperate choices less likely, the creation of rooms where people can live without being curated. The afterlight was not a closure so much as a commitment. The legal outcomes had been partial. The moral work was ongoing. The ledger remained in the archive as a record and a warning. The tin boxes and Polaroids were catalogued and anonymized. They were used in training for social workers and in ethics seminars at art schools. The city had been bruised and had begun, in small ways, to heal. Jonah walked away from the garden with the photograph in his pocket and the letter in his wallet. He felt the case like a living thing that had changed him. He had learned that justice is not only about conviction, but about repair, about creating rooms where people can live without being curated, about building systems that make desperate choices less likely, about listening to voices that refuse to be reduced to headlines. The ledger's cedar leaf would not vanish overnight. Power reconstitutes itself. But the garden's heart had been found, and the people who had been catalogued had begun, in small ways, to reclaim their rooms. Years later, the glass garden had become a small public commons. The community centre that had once been Victor Hale's farmhouse was now a cooperative kitchen and a meeting space for mutual aid groups. The repository had been digitised and anonymised. Researchers used its data to design interventions that reduce precarity in creative economies. The county's emergency grant program had prevented evictions and funded safe exits for people who wanted to leave. Exploitative arrangements. Anna taught a small class on photography and consent at the community centre. Her students were young and hungry for craft and wary of the market's promises. She taught them to make images that honoured subjects rather than consumed them. She taught them to ask for boundaries and to respect refusals. She taught them to keep ledgers of their own, not of favours owed to patrons, but of promises they made to themselves. Jonah visited sometimes, not as an investigator, but as a neighbour. He volunteered at the food pantry and helped teach a class on civic responsibility for teens. He had scars, public and private, but he had also learned to hold complexity without flattening it into certainty. He kept Anna's letter in his wallet and the tin box photograph in a small drawer at home. Mara curated an exhibit at the city archive, Rooms and Windows. It displayed anonymised ledgers, Polaroids and tin boxes alongside essays about consent, patronage, and the ethics of memory. The exhibit was careful and humane. It invited visitors to look and to feel the weight of what had been kept private. Mara wrote a catalogue essay about the responsibility of archivists to preserve without exploiting, to make memory useful for prevention, and to honour the people behind the records. Lila's floral shop became a hub for mutual aid and a place where people could find resources without shame. She organised a programme that paired artists with emergency housing funds and legal aid. She had learned that generosity without accountability can become a weapon. She had learned to make generosity visible and conditional on consent. The ledger remained in the archive as a record and a warning. Students studied it in ethics classes. Policymakers read it in reports. Community organisers used it to argue for better safety nets. The cedar leaf, once a brand of discretion, had been reframed as a symbol of what happens when intimacy is commodified. On a late autumn afternoon, Jonah walked the glass garden and found Anna at the bench, her hands in the soil. She looked up and smiled in a way that reached her eyes. They did not speak of verdicts or indictments. They spoke of small things, the taste of lemon, the stubbornness of roots, the way light falls through leaves. Anna handed Jonah a small seed packet.
"Plant it somewhere," she said.
"Remember the work?" He took the packet and felt the weight of it like a promise. The story did not end with a tidy moral. It ended with a practice, a community that chose to remember, to repair, and to build systems that make desperate choices less likely. The ledger remained in the archive, a record of what had happened and a warning of what can happen when scarcity is left unaddressed. Jonah walked away from the garden with the seed packet in his pocket and the photograph in his wallet. He felt the afterlight like a quiet obligation, to keep looking, to keep listening, and to keep building rooms where people can live without being curated. The orchard of the city had been pruned.
New shoots would grow.
The work of justice, he knew, was not a verdict, but a long season of tending. The indictments that followed named a small group of defendants, Victor Hale, Marcus Vale, and several donors whose names had appeared in the ledger. The charges were not simple. They alleged a pattern of coercive conduct, the use of a trust to facilitate payments designed to create leverage, and the possession and storage of personal artifacts used to maintain control. The legal theory was novel and would be tested in court. As the trial approached, Anna made a choice that reframed the moral center of the case. She agreed to testify publicly, not because she wanted to be a spectacle, but because she wanted to name the ledger's human cost. She sat in the witness chair and spoke in a voice that was steady and precise. She described the invitations, the cedar leaf watermark, the ledger's penciled initials, the envelopes, the tin box, and the way favors had become obligations. Her testimony did not fit the neat categories the public wanted. It was not a tale of abduction or a story of pure consent. It was a ledger of attrition, offers made as favors, favors withheld as punishment, gratitude turned into leverage. She spoke about the shame of being chosen and the shame of being grateful for the very thing that had made her feel small. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet in a way that felt like a verdict. The jurors had heard a human voice that could not be reduced to a headline. The defense tried to pick apart her testimony, selective clips, questions about agency, arguments about artistic freedom, but the pattern she described had been corroborated by documents, manifests, and other witnesses outside the courthouse. The city argued in the language of absolutes. People wanted monsters or saints. They wanted a story that fit neatly into a headline. Jonah found himself resisting that hunger for certainty. He had seen the ledger, the Polaroids, the tin box, and the recordings. He had also seen the small human gestures that complicated the narrative. Anna's careful notes, Lila's shame, Sarah's private notebook, Elise's confession. The trial did not end with a tidy moral. It produced convictions and acquittals, guilty pleas, and hung juries. Some defendants were found guilty of conspiracy and coercion. Others were acquitted on technical grounds. The legal outcomes were messy and partial, justice rendered in degrees rather than absolutes. But the case's larger effect was not only legal. It forced the city to reckon with the ledger's moral economy. Community groups demanded transparency from trusts and foundations. Galleries and salons adopted clearer consent protocols. The DA's office worked with non-profits to create safe exit channels for people who wanted to leave private economies of intimacy without being punished for their choices. Anna's recovery was slow and private. She chose to speak publicly in measured ways and to write in private in ways that were fierce and tender. She published a short essay, part manifesto, part testimony, about rooms and windows and the difference between being looked at and being seen. The essay circulated in the city like a small, stubborn light. Jonah watched the aftermath with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The ledger's cedar leaf had been exposed. The tin boxes had been catalogued. The Polaroids had been shown for what they were. The network had been disrupted but not entirely dismantled. Power has a way of reconstituting itself in new forms. On a late afternoon, months after the raid, Jonah drove to the glass garden. The trellises were green, the lemon tree heavy with fruit. Volunteers picked apples for a community pantry. Children ran between the plots, their laughter bright and ordinary. Anna sat on the bench where the tin box had once been found, her hands in the soil, planting a small seedling. She looked up when Jonah approached and smiled in a way that reached her eyes. They did not speak of verdicts or indictments. They spoke of small things, the taste of lemon, the way light falls through leaves, the stubbornness of roots. Anna handed Jonah a small folded note. On it, in a hand that had once written "for the harvest," always, were 3 words: remember and do better. Jonah folded the note and put it in his pocket. He thought of the ledger and the cedar leaf and the way the city had been forced to look at itself. He thought of the work that remained, policy changes, community support, the slow rebuilding of trust. He thought of Anna's line, "I don't want to be a thing," and felt the urgency of it like a pulse. The garden's heart had been found, and in finding it, they had unearthed a truth that refused to be simple. The network had been exposed, its edges frayed by law and testimony. Some people had been held accountable. Others had slipped away into new forms of discretion. The ledger remained in the archive, a record of what had happened and a warning of what can happen when intimacy is commodified. As Jonah walked away from the garden, the city's light softened into evening. He felt the case like a living thing that had changed him. He had learned that justice is not only about conviction, but about repair, about creating rooms where people can live without being curated, about building systems that make desperate choices less likely, about listening to voices that refuse to be reduced to headlines. Somewhere, a ledger was being updated. Somewhere, a cedar leaf was being stamped on an invitation. But the garden's heart had been found, and the people who had been catalogued had begun, in small ways, to reclaim their rooms. The trial moved like weather, sudden storms, long stretches of grey, moments of brittle sunlight that revealed everything at once. Courtroom days were dense with procedure, objections, motions, expert testimony about audio forensics and chain of custody, careful cross-examinations that tried to turn nuance into doubt. The DA's team presented the ledger as a social architecture. The defense painted salons as consensual gatherings, and the ledger's shorthand as nothing more than bookkeeping. The public watched in fragments, headlines, clips, hot takes. Anna's testimony remained the hinge. She sat in the witness chair with a quiet steadiness that surprised people who had expected spectacle. She described the invitations, the cedar leaf watermark, the ledger's penciled initials, the envelopes left under pillows, the tin box she had kept as a talisman. She spoke about the slow accrual of favors and the way gratitude can become a leash. She spoke about the night at the farmhouse not as a single violent act, but as a negotiation that had been steered away from exit. The jurors listened. They heard the recovered audio in full, the longer takes that had given context to the clipped scream. They heard Sarah's notebook read aloud, the ledger's pages projected on a screen, the manifest that tied crates to storage units. They heard Elise's confession and Lila's testimony about the note she had lied about to protect Anna's plan. They heard Marcus's evasive answers and Victor's lawyer argue for artistic freedom. Verdicts arrived in degrees. Some defendants were convicted on counts that fit the DA's theory: conspiracy to coerce, use of a trust to facilitate payments designed to create leverage, unlawful possession of personal artifacts used to maintain control. Others were acquitted on technical grounds where the defense had successfully raised reasonable doubt about intent or chain of custody. The legal outcomes were messy and partial. They did not map neatly onto the moral map the city had drawn for itself. The aftermath was not only legal. The ledger's exposure forced institutions to look inward. Foundations and trusts adopted clearer transparency rules. Galleries and salons instituted consent protocols and independent advocates for participants. A coalition of non-profits formed a rapid response fund for people who wanted to leave private economies of intimacy without losing housing or health care. The DA's office worked with social services to create safe exit channels and emergency grants. Small, practical measures that aimed to reduce the pressure that had made the ledger's market possible. Anna's recovery was slow and private. She declined many interview requests and refused to be turned into a symbol. When she did speak, it was in measured essays and in a short, fiercely personal piece she published in a local journal, a meditation on rooms and windows, on the difference between being looked at and being seen. She wrote about the ledger as a social contract that had been weaponized, and about the small rituals she had used to remember herself. The tin box, the photograph, the list of names she kept in a notebook she called a map. The city's conversation shifted, not entirely but enough. People began to talk about the ethics of patronage and the responsibilities of institutions that brokered intimacy. Some donors resigned from boards. Some patrons retreated from the salons they had once frequented. Others doubled down, insisting that art must be free of legal policing. The debate was noisy and unresolved, but it had moved from gossip to policy. Jonah felt the cost of the case in the small, private ways it had rearranged his life. The defense's attempt to weaponize his past had left a bruise that did not fully heal. He had to answer questions about judgment and bias. He had to sit through hearings where his motives were past. He lost a promotion he had expected and gained a reputation that was complicated and public. He learned to live with the knowledge that doing the right thing in a messy world often meant paying a personal price. Mara's work shifted from investigation to stewardship. She curated the archive of names and artifacts with a care that felt like penance and repair. The repository they had proposed, anonymized, secure, and community-run, became a pilot program. People deposited ledgers, receipts, and testimonies. Social workers and historians used the anonymized data to design interventions. Mara wrote an essay about the ethics of archiving trauma, how to preserve memory without exploiting it, how to make records useful for prevention rather than spectacle. Lila became an advocate. She testified, she organized, and she worked with community groups to create safe channels for people who needed to leave private economies of intimacy. Her floral shop became a small hub for mutual aid, a place where people could pick up a bag of food, a bus ticket, or a referral to a counselor. She had once tried to protect Anna by keeping a secret. Now she tried to protect others by making help visible. The men who had been convicted served sentences that varied in length. Some cooperated with investigators and provided names in exchange for reduced charges. Others appealed and fought the verdicts in higher courts. The trust that had funneled money into private events dissolved under legal pressure and public scrutiny. New entities rose in its place, some more transparent, some merely rebranded. The ledger's cedar leaf did not disappear. It migrated, as symbols do, into new contexts. Months after the trial, Jonah received a letter from Anna. It was short and handwritten, the kind of note that felt like a small, private thing in a world of press releases. "Thank you for finding me," she wrote. "Not for the headlines, but for the way you listened. Keep looking for the rooms." He kept the letter in his wallet like a talisman. The city's policy changes were modest but meaningful. Emergency grants for people in precarious creative economies, clearer consent protocols at galleries, and a county task force on patronage and power. The repository's anonymized data informed a report that recommended funding for rural and urban safety nets because the ledger had not been only about art. It had been about scarcity and the ways people trade dignity for survival. In the quiet after the trial, Jonah returned to the glass garden. The lemon tree had grown. Volunteers tended plots and taught children how to graft branches and save seeds. Anna visited sometimes, quietly planting seedlings and sitting on the bench with a thermos of tea. She did not seek the camera's light. She preferred the small, ordinary work of tending. One afternoon, Jonah found her at the bench, a small tin box in her lap. She handed it to him without ceremony. Inside was the faded Polaroid he had first seen in the tin box at the garden, the photograph of her on the bench, the note on the back, "For when I forget who I am." She had written a new line on the back, "Remember and do better." Jonah folded the photograph and put it in his pocket. He thought of the ledger and the cedar leaf and the way the city had been forced to look at itself. He thought of the small policy changes and the repository and the people who had been willing to tell the truth. He thought of the work that remained, the slow building of systems that make desperate choices less likely, the creation of rooms where people can live without being curated. The afterlight was not a closure so much as a commitment. The legal outcomes had been partial. The moral work was ongoing. The ledger remained in the archive as a record and a warning. The tin boxes and Polaroids were catalogued and anonymized. They were used in training for social workers and in ethics seminars at art schools. The city had been bruised and had begun, in small ways, to heal. Jonah walked away from the garden with the photograph in his pocket and the letter in his wallet. He felt the case like a living thing that had changed him. He had learned that justice is not only about conviction, but about repair, about creating rooms where people can live without being curated, about building systems that make desperate choices less likely, about listening to voices that refuse to be reduced to headlines. The ledger's cedar leaf would not vanish overnight. Power reconstitutes itself. But the garden's heart had been found, and the people who had been catalogued had begun, in small ways, to reclaim their rooms. Years later, the glass garden had become a small, public commons. The community centre that had once been Victor Hale's farmhouse was now a cooperative kitchen and a meeting space for mutual aid groups. The repository had been digitised and anonymised. Researchers used its data to design interventions that reduced precarity in creative economies. The county's emergency grant program had prevented evictions and funded safe exits for people who wanted to leave. Exploitative arrangements. Anna taught a small class on photography and consent at the community centre. Her students were young and hungry for craft and wary of the market's promises. She taught them to make images that honoured subjects rather than consumed them. She taught them to ask for boundaries and to respect refusals. She taught them to keep ledgers of their own, not of favours owed to patrons, but of promises they made to themselves. Jonah visited sometimes, not as an investigator, but as a neighbour. He volunteered at the food pantry and helped teach a class on civic responsibility for teens. He had scars, public and private, but he had also learned to hold complexity without flattening it into certainty. He kept Anna's letter in his wallet and the tin box photograph in a small drawer at home. Mara curated an exhibit at the city archive, Rooms and Windows. It displayed anonymized ledgers, Polaroids and tin boxes alongside essays about consent, patronage, and the ethics of memory. The exhibit was careful and humane. It invited visitors to look and to feel the weight of what had been kept private. Mara wrote a catalogue essay about the responsibility of archivists to preserve without exploiting, to make memory useful for prevention, and to honour the people behind the records. Lila's floral shop became a hub for mutual aid and a place where people could find resources without shame. She organised a programme that paired artists with emergency housing funds and legal aid. She had learned that generosity without accountability can become a weapon. She had learned to make generosity visible and conditional on consent. The ledger remained in the archive as a record and a warning. Students studied it in ethics classes. Policymakers read it in reports. Community organisers used it to argue for better safety nets. The cedar leaf, once a brand of discretion, had been reframed as a symbol of what happens when intimacy is commodified. On a late autumn afternoon, Jonah walked the glass garden and found Anna at the bench, her hands in the soil. She looked up and smiled in a way that reached her eyes. They did not speak of verdicts or indictments. They spoke of small things, the taste of lemon, the stubbornness of roots, the way light falls through leaves. Anna handed Jonah a small seed packet. "Plant it somewhere," she said. "Remember the work?" He took the packet and felt the weight of it like a promise. The story did not end with a tidy moral. It ended with a practice, a community that chose to remember, to repair, and to build systems that make desperate choices less likely. The ledger remained in the archive, a record of what had happened and a warning of what can happen when scarcity is left unaddressed. Jonah walked away from the garden with the seed packet in his pocket and the photograph in his wallet. He felt the afterlight like a quiet obligation to keep looking, to keep listening, and to keep building rooms where people can live without being curated. The orchard of the city had been pruned. New shoots would grow. The work of justice, he knew, was not a verdict, but a long season of tending.
Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.